Hello, I'm Joe Outlaw, Extension Economist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and I also serve as the Secretary of the Texas Ag Forum. Today, I'm going to be serving as the moderator for this meeting. We have practiced a number of times for this session, and I can tell you that I've practiced more for this than I have for anything else in my 30 plus years in Extension. And given that we're going through technology, I expect to have a few hiccups here and there, but I would appreciate it if you bear with us and as we navigate this new virtual world. Personally, I can't wait to get to visit with all of you again. We will do our best to stay on schedule this afternoon. The speakers are here for you and want to help you with your questions. We will be monitoring the question and answer panel, or you can call 979-845-5913, and someone will take your question and bring it to me, and I will get it to the presenters. If you cannot stay the entire time, but you'd like to submit a question, we will answer those after the fact and post them to the Ag and Food Policy Center website. If you can, please stay around to the end and answer the evaluation questions before exiting Zoom. There'll be time to do that. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Charles Ring. Normally the producer chair of the Texas Ag Forum serves as the moderator for the in-person meetings. But today that was just going to be too difficult with all the things we have to do switching from speaker to speaker. So without any further ado, welcome Charles.
Good morning. You've got me muted. There you go. I think we're all learning now. I'm Charles Ring. I'm chair of the Texas Ag Forum Steering Committee. I produce corn, cotton, sorghum, and a handful of cows down in South Texas, down near St. Paul and Corpus Christi. The Texas Ag Forum is directed by a steering committee that represents every major component of Texas agriculture. And I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to join us. The Texas Ag Forum's mission is to educate the public on key issues affecting Texas agriculture. We've been doing this now for over 30 years. It occurred to me the other day that a farmer knows a little bit about a whole lot of different things, and education will continue. Texas Ag Forum mission is to educate the public. We had originally planned for this Ag Forum to have been about 2 weeks ago. In our discussions, we had envisioned the forum would focus on other important topics, and seems like more important things have come along in the last few months, and it got by us. COVID-19 isn't just the issue of our time, it's the issue of our generation. We meet today through this technology to discuss the COVID-19 and how it's affecting and will be impacting Texas agriculture. I want to thank our steering committee for their support in this virtual Ag Forum. I think I've done about 4 or 5 of these in the last month now. It would also not be possible without the support of Texas AgriLife, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and the Agriculture and Food Policy Center at Texas A&M. I think Joe alluded to it. Before we get started, everybody will be muted. Microphones pick up sounds from all parts of where you're sitting. There'll be time for questions, and if you have a question, please type it in to question and answer area at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and Joe will ask your question on your behalf. We certainly want to thank all of our speakers today for their efforts. We especially want to thank our speaker, Mike Conaway, Congressman Mike Conaway, and he's in his 8th term. He represents 29 counties in Texas, 11th Congressional District. Presently, the ranking member of the House Ag Committee, and he served as chairman from 2015 to 2019. I do want to say personally that I've got to visit with him over the last 12 years. He's been one of the most receptive, most cordial, helpful congressmen we've been able to visit with. He understands, for some reason, our unique industry. I say unique because we're being affected very hard by the COVID, this virus. My corn is not in Mexico now because of it, not because of the COVID-19, but because of the effect it's had on the peso and the dollar. I mean, we're affected as we get into the grocery stores and the shelves are empty. People have, I think, realized now how important we are. Thanks again, Mr. Conaway, and I will turn it to you.
Well, Charles, thank you. And Joe and Bart, thank you for having me on. I appreciate that. I would much prefer to be speaking in person to everyone. I know all of you would, but this is what it is, and I'm glad you were able to pivot to a different circumstance. We've now passed 3.5 or 4 bills, but 3 efforts had responded to COVID. I represent a unique area of the United States in that we are, in addition to agriculture, we're also the epicenter for shale fracking and oil and gas production. And coincident with the COVID issue is a dramatic drop in the commodity price for crude oil. In fact, a week ago tomorrow, it went upside down. It was actually a negative $40 a barrel for crude oil, and that's never happened in my lifetime before. And so our part of the world out here is dealing with the COVID, but also with crude oil as well. With respect to the 3 efforts, the most recent one, the CARES Act, obviously was the signature issue for the broader effort to try to help all of Americans build that bridge between where we are with respect to the dealing with COVID-19 and also getting the other side of it and getting our economy back up and running and moving forward. A lot of money was spent. A lot of money is being spent and sent out. Last week, I went back to D.C. to vote on the 3.5 CARES Act, which basically a replenishment of the funding under the main programs that were involved there. As an aside, I don't think I've ever been on a trip with as few people as I was last week. When I went through the airport in Dallas, there were more people in the Lowe's hardware store that I've been visiting with my wife over the last 3 weeks than there were at DFW Airport. The flight from DC from Dallas to DC on a 737, there were 12 passengers, 5 crew persons, no cabin service. And then coming home on Friday after the vote Thursday night, there were about 30 of us on the plane. But nevertheless, a surreal experience. If you've not flown yet under these circumstances, it is really weird to go through DFW, which is normally a bustling city in itself. Restaurants and all that, those are all closed. There's a 7-Eleven-esque kind of place that was open, but other than that, there's nothing else going on in that airport. So it's just a weird circumstance. Improvements in the 3.5 Act clearly made ag eligible for the SBA's longstanding emergency injury disaster loan program, which previously had ag had not been eligible for those loans. This 3.5 Act clearly makes ag eligible for that. The bad news is that SBA is being overrun. They underwrite those loans themselves, direct lending from the SBA, and they don't have the capacity to deal with all of the loans that are in place right now, or the requests are in place right now. And so while ag has been added to the program, they've announced that they're not going to deal with new applications for the EIDL program until they get the backlog dealt with. So stay tuned in that regard. On the Paycheck Protection Plan, ag was involved there. Some modifications or interpretations that have helped in that regard is that they've now announced that they'll allow for seasonal workers a floating 12-week period for you to be able to figure out what your payroll is to apply for those. And they still don't have an answer yet on whether what you pay to H-2A and H-2B workers would qualify for the loans as well. But nevertheless, progress is being made in that regard also. There's a general comments about the money going out. The CARES Act, they also provided, as you know, a replenishment of the CCC, the Commodities Credit Corporation, a partial replenishment, but also a $9.5 billion blanket amount for Sonny Perdue to come up with a program to address the unique needs of production agriculture. The particulars. Well, that program was announced last week. We still don't have the particulars, other than there was announced a payment limit of $125,000 per crop, $250,000 per farmer. That is unworkable. We've shared that with the Secretary. He hears it. The House members have shared letters. The Senate members have shared letters with the Secretary. And as I understand it, they're at least taking a look at it to decide what they can do. They didn't change the total amount announced that the Secretary announced last week was $16 billion for production agriculture, $3 billion for direct purchases in commodities. The details on the 16 we're waiting those to come out now with the rules to be written. But if you don't change the 16 and you do change the payment level issue, then that's going to reset how that program is going to be working. And so stay tuned for those announcements. The Secretary has been open to our suggestions, but right now we don't have a lot of information in that regard. The regional Senate bill that gave birth to the CARES Act provided for a full replenishment of the CCC up to the $30 billion mark. That's their lending cap, but also an increase in that cap of $20 billion, so that it got to a total of $50. If you took the $30 billion, which was set, that cap was set in the mid 80s. If you just simply adjusted that for inflation over that time frame, something that Joe and Bart are good at doing for us. But if you simply adjusted that, it would be $68 billion if the cap had been just kept pace with inflation. So you can see how woefully inadequate the 30 is to begin with against inflation-adjusted numbers, which gets us jammed up from time to time. So the 9.5 and the replenishment of 30 plus another 20 meant that there would have been about $43 billion in new money or money available for Purdue to have worked with had the Senate bill been passed. Something happened. It coincided with Speaker Pelosi's weighing in. I don't know if it's her or the Senate Democrats who decided that was a bad idea, but the money that came out was the 9.5 that I talked about and the $14 billion replenishment that gets us to about a total of $23.5 billion that will be available to the Secretary. Way short of the resources that would have been provided had the Senate bill prevailed. I don't know why the Democrats did that. Everybody gets to make their mind up for themselves. But what they did was move the number from $43 billion down to $23 billion. And we can decide, you can ask your Democrat friends why they let that happen or why they thought that was a good idea to take that approach to rural America and the resources that production agriculture clearly needs. Secretary Perdue surveyed the damage it's done to the various industries, and he told me in a conversation that almost every segment came to him needing about $5 billion. And those all totaled up to just north of $40 billion of requests had he been able to make the request for each one of them. He found $6 billion of existing money in CCC that he's going, or $6.5 billion, that he's going to spend as a part of the 16 and the 9.5. Some of us would have preferred that he go ahead and commit the other 14, even though the restrictions on it placed by, I believe, the Democrats that not be available to July 1st, that he should have committed all of it at that point in time. He chose not to. It's his call to make. We get to put our opinions in, and he chose to go a different route. What that will allow, though, is that once this 16 is dispersed, then he'll have 14 between July 1st and then in September to perhaps come with another round of assistance that maybe is more targeted toward the areas that they get left out or that don't get adequate funding for in the 16 billion. But even the 30 total that will make is way short of the total amount. Don't get me wrong, $23 billion is a stunning amount of money. The 16 that's coming out right now dwarfs what we would do normally in a farm bill, increases over 10 years. And so there's a lot of money coming into the program, but there's a lot of hurt and pain. Putting on my Captain Obvious hat, most of America's economy is doing really well ahead of COVID-19. Agriculture was not. So when the rest of the economy goes into begins to experience the impacts that the social distancing and the shutdown that's gone on, they had a backdrop of good times coming into that. That was not the case with production agriculture. We're 7 years now of reduced incomes. Incomes are still below the 2013 levels, and all the losses over that time frame, in spite of the government help and assistance that's come in there, producers are still upside down, got more debt than they really need, and we're not in good shape before this started, and they're not in any better shape right now. Let me make a couple of comments on the supply chain, and then we'll get to your questions. And again, thanks for having me on. Supply chain is strained, no doubt about it. Most of that strain is a result of us switching from eating over half of our meals in restaurants to now eating at home. My wife has cooked more meals at home in the last month than I think in the last 15 years. I'm happy about that. She's may not be all that happy about it, but that supply chain that packaged food for and had set up distribution systems for restaurants now has to pivot back to getting it into grocery stores. And obviously the packaging is different, the labeling is different, all that kind of good stuff. And the system is making those adjustments. As a processor, do I make the adjustments that are permanent, that I'm never, I'm going to sell to restaurants again, or do I do temporary things so that we think the supply chain will get back to ultimately all of us going back out to restaurants and eating? So there are things that are going on from just an economic standpoint that the processors are having to come to grips with. And then you begin to have cases of COVID in our meat processing plants that have gotten some publicity over the last couple of weeks. None of us want anybody to go to work and get sick, but the meat processing is an essential program for our nation. It's a national security issue. All food processing is a national security issue because we've not experienced we've experienced hunger in America, but not because of shortage of food. It just was in the wrong spot, or people didn't have the resources to pay for that. But Secretary Perdue is watching this issue on every category as to how the supply chain is coping with that shift from restaurant deliveries to grocery store deliveries, and then at some point in time shifting back to restaurant deliveries. But we're all watching that, and I'm particularly concerned about the meat side. We don't want to have Americans get unduly concerned about their food supply and then go out and do what they've done with toilet paper and sweep the shelves clean of it and have a lifetime supply of toilet paper back home and cause that kind of a hoarding and or panic buying that might result. And so we've got to be nuanced with our conversation, honest. Yes, we're having issues with our plants. They're beginning to shut down. Yes, the system is having to deal with an example, pigs that, because of that just-in-time delivery system, the slaughter plants had just the exact number of pigs they wanted to kill every day at the right weight, showing up every day through the process. Now, if they shut down, as they've done in several places, obviously that supply chain gets backed up. That impacts the pricing that flows back down to producers, et cetera, et cetera. So let's watch the supply chain. Let's be honest with the American people about it. But let's also be careful that we don't unduly scare them into buying things or in quantities that would exacerbate our program. So got to brag on Bart Fischer. He and Joe Outlaw at AFPC have been really, really helpful throughout the last 4 weeks. And we tried to come to grips with all of the things that we've been dealing with across this spectrum. And they have been invaluable in helping us do what we need to do. So as I understand it, Bart's on the program later on in the afternoon. It would do my heart really good if I got a report that he was asked at least one or two questions that he simply couldn't answer. So put your best questions on and stump Bart for me, and let me know that probably one of the smartest guys walking that you guys were able to stump him. So with that, Joe and Charles, be happy to take any questions that someone might have.
Thank you. I'm going to, there's been a number of questions, and I'm going to read the first one. Hopefully you can still hear everything. The first question for Mr. Conaway is, what are the chances of having MFP payments in 2020?
First time I've been asked that. The MFP payments were tied to the trade issues with China, et cetera. Phase one was supposed to be kicking in right now, so a lot of moving parts there. We don't think that the commitment by China was a 2-year commitment in total, not an annual commitment per se, and so we're not sure kind of where those numbers are going. But the Secretary has been committed that if the data shows that this price disruption or the pain associated with the trade disruption with China is related to that, then it would be an MFP-esque kind of payment. The problem there is that those MFP payments come out of the CCC. And if he spends the $14 billion replacement that begins on July 1st, he's only got up to 30 to work with. And we're going to have another replenishment of CCC as a part of whatever appropriations process goes on for fiscal 2020. But I wouldn't rule it out. But I also, given the amount of money that's going to be spent on these payments in this regard, and also the effort among several, Colin Peterson, myself, and others, to try to help our colleagues understand that the 9.5 and the 14 was a great start, but it doesn't come close to getting us where we need to get to. I don't know that we'd have an MFP payment on top of that. So stay tuned. It's too early to tell, but we're hopeful to get additional new resources under Secretary Perdue's tutelage that we then help address this issue.
Well, thanks. A lot of questions about different types of payments. One question here is, how likely is it that the 2018 Farm Bill gets reopened in some manner?
Well, not likely. If Peterson and I have our druthers, because that's a dangerous precedent to set to make that happen. But obviously, the 2023 Farm Bill will be informed by how the system reacted to or didn't react to this pandemic and the future the opportunities or threat of future pandemics and how the system would react to that. So I'm not in favor of it, but stay tuned. There will be those who want to do that. If that happens, then we may have set ourselves up for a real problem in that the 5-year program we've been working on this since I've been in Congress, and actually somewhat before that, right, wrong, or different, at least allowed you some stability in the program that you and your bankers could count on. If we open it up now and succumb to that, that temptation, then future Congresses can continue to fine tune that. And, we're not sure that future Congresses will be as sympathetic to production agriculture issues as we were in 2018. Remember, we had 369 votes in the House and 87 votes in the Senate, record numbers in both houses in support of rural America and production agriculture. I don't know that will always be the case. So I'd be hard pressed to reopen the Farm Bill.
Okay, thank you. The next question has to do with packers, and there's 2 of them, so I'll just read them together and let you respond. The first one is, it's been reported that USDA is investigating beef packers. How long does that typically take? And then the second part of that, maybe related, is a question that came in through the Q&A. I understand just a few minutes ago that President Trump just invoked the National Defense Act, thereby having processing plants to remain open. They wanted to know if there's anything you wanted to say about that.
All right. Well, there's always tension, and it's grown as packing plants across the country. The ownership has consolidated down to the quote unquote big 4. There's always been tension between the packers and the folks who grow the animals and try to do that. Last year, as you know, we had the fire at the Holcomb plant. It caused a disruption in the markets that didn't look weird, and so the investigation was started on that. I believe that the impact of this coronavirus and the impact it's had on depressed prices for live cattle and live pigs versus what the packers are getting on the other end of boxed beef is typically principally a beef issue. Again, disruption that may very well be explained by just the market disruptions that are caused by, when I go to a restaurant, I order a higher quality of beef than when I buy it at the grocery store, all those kinds of things. And then the supply chain with packing houses being disrupted on staying open. So I believe that that's been added to the Holcomb investigation. Those things take a long time, but CFTC always looks at disruptions in markets or market prices that go weird from the cash market to the commodities, and so that CFTC will be looking at if that ever happens, they look at it as well. But there is an investigation with respect to that. I didn't know if the president was going to get that out while we were on the call, but apparently he has, and deeming the beef packing as essential under the Defense Production Act. We are still trying to understand exactly what that means. I think it will mean that additional PPE and other equipment, PPE, and other equipment necessary to do as good a job as you can to keep the employees who man those packing plants as safe as they can from becoming infected is be a part of that. In other words, it'll hopefully raise the priority status of meat packing from where it is right now to where it will be under this under the president's executive order that establishes this. And so stay tuned. We've had a lot of suggestions on how we could get that done, a lot of conversations with the vice president and others to increase that. You've seen where the CDC has come out with specific guidance on the plant in South Dakota, but it's also come out with broader guidance as to what they believe are their recommendations, not their requirements, but their recommendations on how plants can do the right thing in terms of moving their people in and out of the plant, shift change, breaks, and all those kind of things, what their workstations look like, what the equipment they need within their workstations. All of those things are part of this review that the CDC has just announced, and the idea of being able to allow employers to ask people to come back to work. They want them to be as safe as they can, and we're not sure also what the Defense Production Act does vis-a-vis liabilities that a company might have if people come back to work and get sick with COVID, where that liability lies, either federal government or with the company. Because I know if I was an owner or manager, I would want to make sure that I'm keeping people as, doing the guidelines and keep it as safe as I can. But you and I all know that, and particularly with respect to agriculture, there's some really wily plaintiffs lawyers out there who can figure out that trucks running up and down the road have become a nuisance because they're driving to a plant that's been in existence for 50 years. And that truck is creating noises that's become a nuisance, and they've sued. And so every owner out there is clearly worried about plaintiff lawyers coming to bear to cause wreak havoc should they get employees get sick.
Thank you. Now there's another series about payments again. So what are your thoughts on a potential phase 4? And if we get a new phase 4, does that mean that we're going to get additional funding for the CCC?
Well, the phase 4 is there's some political games being played with quote unquote a phase 4. There's an awful lot of things being shopped as could be caught in phase 4. Leadership on the Republican side, I agree, it's a little premature to do a broad phase 4 because we're spending a lot of money flowing into the system now. We really want to see how the recovery begins, which in Texas starts on Friday, how that recovery begins and how that begins to flow through and begins to ameliorate some of the things that have been the negative impacts that have been going on. So before we do a phase 4, I want to see where the ongoing wreck is, where the pain is that didn't get addressed in the other issues, and we just don't know that yet. So it's premature across most of society. Ag is not the same way, though. It's clear that just based on this first round of losses between January 15th and April 15th, which is what Secretary Perdue is using the money he's got right now, the $16 billion trying to adjust, is woefully short of the impact that coronavirus and the shutdown has had on rural American production agriculture. So I would hope that additional money would be involved in a phase 4. Should we get it in the phase 4, I'll certainly be supportive of additional agricultural funding in that. But on the broader question of when a phase 4 might happen, a little premature. As an aside note, Majority Leader announced over the weekend that we were coming back in on Monday of next week. He's announced today that we're not coming back in next Monday because they don't know yet how to function in the House. We had a really orchestrated voting schedule last week. We had 2 votes, took about 4 hours to get the 2 votes done. And that's not conducive to us being able to get our work done. So we've got a 6-person panel put together of leaders who are looking at that. They had a meeting last Thursday. We've got another one tonight, I believe. They're coming up with plans and recommendations as to how the House can get back together and function with the legislative body, still social distancing and all those kind of good things. So the idea of a plan 4 right now in the House, we're working on how to figure out how to get the House back in session, how we could be a little more under quote unquote regular order than what we've been in the past. But short answer, Joe, is I would be very supportive because I think that the evidence is already in that there's still damage in rural America and production agriculture that has not yet been addressed with the first 3.5 bills that have been passed.
Thank you. One question that you may or may not, you could punt to this one to Bart if you'd like. For the Paycheck Protection Program, you mentioned additional flexibility. Do you think it will be more workable for farmers and ranchers in the future?
I do. I think they've gone to say sole proprietors under the original plan was you had to present a Schedule C or support your program. Farmers don't use Schedule C; they use Schedule F. Treasury's now announcing that, yep, okay, Schedule F works. We'll get to do those. One wrinkle that we're still trying to push on is that the rules say you have to show profitability, and that's been obviously hard in production agriculture to make that happen. So I do think that Treasury, I've been really impressed both with SBA and Treasury, just how responsive they've been to, no one on the front end could have written all the things that need to be done to make this thing work. But as the issues arose throughout this last 4 weeks, since the first bill passed, the CARES Act passed on March 27th, at every step, Treasury and SBA have been as flexible as they possibly could be in order to try to make this thing work for as many people as possible. So I've been impressed with that. I don't anticipate that attitude changing. So as we find additional issues like this H-2A issue with respect to ag workers and being able to use those costs as part of the payroll computation, still don't have an answer to that. We've raised it over and over with Treasury. The problem with the language of the bill is it says you have to, wages paid to a U.S. resident. I don't know that we can argue that a temporary resident is resident. Just depends on how you interpret that. But I know that Treasury is struggling with that issue to try to get to an answer. So broadly speaking, they've been really responsive to issues that we've raised with respect to how this bill relates to production agriculture. We clearly, though, on the 3.5 bill that passed last week, added ag to idle programs specifically in order to overcome the rulemaking and everything else that had to have been done to make that process happen. This was just quicker to get it done this way.
Okay. You got a couple of more minutes with us. Hopefully you can hang on. I got two more questions. One that says, we are very grateful and appreciative of all your support and help. But there's a but. There's always a but, Congressman.
Always a but.
But we would like to know when WIP Plus for drought could be paid. Do you know anything about that?
Well, yeah, we try to walk a fine line. There's some administrative issues with respect to WIP Plus. Sign up start, I think, on March 23rd and moving forward. Obviously, with the $9.5 billion money that dropped in their lap and the 6 that they're going to add to it to get to 16, coming up with that process, USDA has been busy, for lack of a better phrase. And so we've been trying not to put too much pressure on them, but just continue to remind them that that's the case. The full Ag Committee has a call here in a few minutes with Secretary Perdue, and I'm pretty confident that issue will come up, and he may have a response to kind of when that might happen. But we have been nudging them as gently as we can, understanding and appreciating the busy thing they've got going on with obviously WIP Plus, this bill, the normal process of things that are happening that are going on out there. They've had their plate really full because we want to get the $16 billion out as fast as possible. And that requires them to write rules, do all those kind of things. And it's, much of the same people are trying to multitask, so to speak, to make that happen. But members are aware of it. We've made Sonny aware of it. And I'll perhaps have a little bit better sense of what that might happen after our call with Sonny here in a few minutes.
Okay, last question, and this one came in on the question and answer, and I'm going to try to paraphrase it for you. Is there a program that could be started where smaller farmers could get more exposure when something like this happens to have more resource opportunities?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question. Obviously, we do a lot of things on the front end of trying to work with beginning farmers, veteran farmers, young farmers, all those things that go into our farm bill to try to incentivize new farmers to come into the program. The folks at USDA obviously understand. I think that's one of the reasons they put the payment limit to 125 was to want to make sure that group at the bottom, in terms of the scale of production, scale of revenues, is appreciated. I need to think about that one, and obviously. As we go about fine-tuning the 2023 Farm Bill, we do put a lot of emphasis every time on disadvantaged farmers, farm veterans, that kind of thing. But I'll look at how do these programs react, and how did this process react to folks up and down the revenue chain, folks at the highest revenues, folks as people that make a living at farming. We need to be careful, though, that if I've got $1,000 of revenue off my farming operation, I'm not feeding my family with doing that. And so what the Farm Bill, in my humble opinion, should focus on is those farmers who feed their families and make a living at it and bigger. and not the folks who aren't, it's a sideline or side business. I got that. Shouldn't exclude them necessarily. But as we look at who we help in these crisis situations like that, the folks who that's their, that they got all in on farming. They don't have other things that they're doing, or their wife may be doing something else, but they're, they're a full-time farmer trying to make this thing work. To me, that's who the farm bill and these farm programs should take care of first. Not ignoring the folks who have smaller operations, but if they're not feeding their families, and they're not with $1,000 in revenue a year, that's not a farm that's, for lack of a better phrase, systemically vital to the system. Don't want to downplay their importance and how thankful we are for what they're doing, but in terms of public policy, it really needs to be the folks who feed their family doing it and bigger.
Okay, so I lied to you. There's one question that just came in. Do you have time for one more before you jump?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm on your payroll.
This will be the last one more. What about TWIP Plus due to excessive moisture? Presidential disaster declaration just flood, not excess moisture.
So I'm not aware of that problem. I'm aware that we've had a bit of an issue with respect to excessive drying or excessive winds or something like that. It was kind of was jamming it up. Excuse me, working with our folks that on Matt Schertz and those guys working with the USDA to make sure that interpretation wasn't going on. But I'll need to take that one for the record. Matt's on the call with me. He's listening in as well. So we'll take that on the call to see what that might be. But we specifically added excessive moisture and too much rain to the WIP Plus in order to get that done. So let me take that one for the record.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time, Mr. Conaway, and obviously I speak for this whole group, saying that we wouldn't be in a good position without you, and we really appreciate all your efforts and your time today.
Well, Joe and everybody, Charlie, thank you very much for getting to address you one more time. I appreciate that. This my 16 years in Congress, 15 and a half now, has been the highlight of my life. It's been a labor of love. I've enjoyed every minute of it, and mainly because I get to work on behalf of the folks in this call. Some of the hardest working, most decent people on the face of the earth feed me every day, and I couldn't be more appreciative of that. That said, we're going to get through this. Yes, there are hard times, and yes, there are people struggling, and the things going on that are beyond imaginable in terms of 3 months ago. Any of us thinking, it's hard in agriculture. Nobody knew it'd be this much harder, 3 months later. But, the system is working to try to provide resources to, help where they can. But just know that we are tougher than these circumstances. We are better than these circumstances. And we're going to get through this as a group. And to the extent that individuals need specific help, my team is always available to have one-on-one conversations with anybody out there that's specifically needing assistance making this thing work. But Joe and Bart, thank you very much for what you guys do at the Ag and Food Policy deal, and I certainly appreciate being on the call today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, our next presentation is going to be by Dr. David Anderson, who is the livestock specialist here, but his official title is Professor and Extension Economist, Livestock and Food Product Marketing. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Joe. Let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. Great. I'm going to make the assumption you guys can give me the thumbs up or whatever that we're on, and you can see the slides. Thanks, Henry. Gosh, let's jump right in. I'll tell you what, so many of us, we know what's happened and how we've got in this mess so far. And so I wanted to do a little more of where to from here. I was checking my phone. Henry's going to give me a sign if something goes wrong. So I'm a little more interested in where to from here. And so with that in mind, I think the first thing I would point out that I want to think in terms of an overview is that no matter what livestock species we're talking about, beef, hogs, chickens, dairy, sheep, and goats, there's a lot in common in terms of what the effects are. We're all going through some adjustments. And I think the third thing we'll hit on is that these adjustments are going to ripple through this industry for a long time to come. What we see happening so far is kicking off a series of events that's going to last into next year as well. And so, if we think about that, these adjustments in common, we've had lots of people talk about restaurants, farm-to-table restaurants, these kinds of things like that. In a way, the effects of this are almost the opposite from table to farm. Roughly half of our food we were purchasing away from home. So we've got this whole shift from the restaurant supply chain to the grocery store supply chain. And we eat different things between the two of those, different forms, different sizes, different cuts. We've also got grocery stores that what I just termed recession stocking. We know in the Great Recession, for instance, people ate beef, but they ate fewer steaks and more hamburger. And so we have grocery stores stocking shelves in some parts of the country in anticipation of what folks are going to buy in a recession. More ground beef, more chicken, more value cuts across all of our species. So we've got that going on as well. And then the wave of coronavirus hits plants, where we have slowdowns and shutdowns of plants, which causes a whole nother set of ripple effects. And we know what those are in terms of plants closing, lower producer prices, and higher meat prices. So producers are hit with losses, yet our consumers are going to be facing even higher prices. At the same time, we're thinking about recession and rising unemployment and lack of income. I think another point that's really been overlooked as this hits, as we start to reopen our economy, we're really hitting a double whammy on our restaurant sector. So as restaurants are starting to reopen from being shut down and all the financial losses they have faced, they are reopening in a climate of sharply rising meat prices. And so the effects that they see are really going to get the double whammy, I think. And then further ripple-on effects of this are really going to come from lower producer prices. What's the supply response to disastrously low hog prices? When we're forcing when producers are faced with the decision of euthanizing pigs now, those pigs, whether little or big, they won't be available to a packing plant down the road. In terms of they're not going to be available whether that plant's open or not. They're not going to be available to go to those. So I want to touch on a set of charts across all of our livestock species that kind of highlight on these basic effects. First off, let's start with cattle slaughter. You can clearly see as we look at this, the blue line being 2020. We moved a lot of cattle through the system in March. In fact, throughout the whole first quarter of the year. Yet it's pretty easy to see for folks who are more picture inclined like me. Look at this decline in cattle slaughter that we're seeing as plants close down and as plants slow down. And so it's a pretty sharp decline. In fact, when I see charts that look like this, I accuse people of having a typo in there, but there's no typo this time. And if I was to convert this to beef production, and we think about weekly beef production, we've gone from producing right before this, the plants start closing down, roughly 1 2/3 pounds per day, per week, per person. Now we've cut to just over 1 pound per capita per week. So we've lost about 1/2 pound of beef production per week per person. So this gets at this idea. I've had a ton of reporters call me during this week about and late last week about shortages and things like that, how it's going to affect the retail market. And certainly we're producing less. It's not like we're producing nothing, but we're producing less. And it really highlights, I think that's a pretty good chart for taking a look at the adjustment process that we're seeing from the plant shutdowns and slowdowns. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning too, looking at all of our species, we have plants shutting down and slowing down, but we also have plants reopening. And that balance of reopening after shutdowns and new ones shutting down and others reopening creates even a harder thing to predict in terms of what's the rate or the relative amounts of opening and closing going on that we're going to face over the next few weeks. As these, I'm going to focus on cattle again for another couple minutes, and really these ripple effects move on through the system while we're sending fewer cattle to market, we're processing fewer cattle. That has already backed up into the number of cattle on feed being 5% below a year ago on April 1. So we're backing up cattle throughout the production system. Fewer on feed, meaning that those cattle were already produced, so they're out there on pastures somewhere. As we look at meat prices, heck, look, this is another chart that ought to be a typo for what it looks like, but this is the wholesale value of choice beef. So this run to record prices, the first run to record prices was just a month ago as the stampede at grocery stores happened. That slacked off. And then all of a sudden we have this new increase to record high prices that hit $311 a hundredweight yesterday. And that's what I've plugged in this chart. This is a supply-driven part, whereas the one before was demand-driven. This is supply-driven simply by plants closing down. So that double whammy on our restaurants, I think you can pretty clearly see that there. And also the effect of one of the things we will see in grocery stores is just plain higher meat prices. As we cut back production, we're going to see higher prices for all of our consumers, including us consumers. Fed cattle prices certainly declining, averaging $1 last week. Again, we've lost the demand from plants to buy those animals, and we've also curtailed supplies going out the other end to consumers. And calf prices follow suit, with lower calf prices certainly well below a year ago, reflecting the ripple effects of this through the system. A lot has been said about our dairy industry. You know, Texas is a pretty major dairy producing state. I thought I would stick production in there real quick. This whole thing hits as what we call the spring flush begins, and milk production is greater than a year ago. That's contributed to dumping milk in some parts of the country, but we're also just in the first phases of how we respond to disastrously low prices and start trying to curtail milk production. And I'm going to show disastrously low prices in terms of just plain cheddar cheese prices. These are 40-pound blocks, weekly prices dropping dramatically. Again, the effects of the restaurant trade and grocery store trade. And there are other prices we could certainly show. I just sort of thought we'd start with this one to get a good picture of what's going on in that sector. I want to say a little bit about hogs. They're certainly much larger hog producing states than we are. But again, just like beef, this sharp decline in hog slaughter. Thanks, Henry. I got the sign. This sharp decline in hog slaughter, again, we're losing about 0.5 pound of pork production per capita per week on the hog side. Sharply lower production. Wholesale prices skyrocketing higher, and lower hog prices as well. I do want to, we don't often talk a lot about the broiler side of it, but certainly east of 35, we're a pretty major broiler producing state. It's sort of your what comes first, chicken or eggs. Well, I'm going to start with broiler chicks placed in for grow out. And again, sharp declines in chicks placed, responding to slowdowns at plants and falling prices. I'll tell you what, this chart is wholesale chicken wings. If there ain't no sports and your restaurants are closed, what's a wing worth? And they have collapsed in price as well. And certainly I think it highlights the struggles a little bit on the chicken side of things as well. I want to wrap this up with a couple things to think about. What's the response here? We're certainly cutting production because plants are closed. That generates lower prices and unprofitable prices to ranchers, to producers, to chicken growers, and the economic response is to cut production. And so the knock-on effects of this, as this ripples forward, is an economic response to disastrously low prices. And so when we think about ripple effects of this, this is going to go on for a long time. Again, this is uncharted territory for us. If we think about short-term versus long-term, short-term, we got some pretty tough problems. Longer term, particularly if we want to talk about beef, I would have a more optimistic outlook for calf prices given some more time to pass. But again, these ripples are going to affect our industries across all of us for a long time. I'll throw out a couple of examples. You know, ethanol for the livestock side led to sharply higher feed costs, rising cost of production, and it triggered a series of production cuts across livestock agriculture. So we've seen that before. And this has some elements of that. In 1998, we produced more hogs than we had packing capacity for, and we saw 7-cent hogs in 1998. That triggered a whole production contraction because of profits. If we want to go back a little further, we might think in 1971 and 73, the Nixon administration imposed wage and price controls. And in the uneven application of that, that forced ripple effects like this across all of livestock agriculture, including euthanizing livestock, leading to sharply declining cattle numbers. Yet none of these little examples tell the full picture because of all the demand side interactions caused by coronavirus. I think the last thing I would point out is all of us, across agriculture, but also across those who aren't involved in agriculture, everybody's going to learn a heck of a lot about the supply chain in agriculture. And maybe that's a good thing that people become a little more educated, but I'd just soon not had to learn that lesson the way it's been dealt out to us. But, I think if we put all this together, this is, in summary, certainly sharply lower producer prices, and the ripple effects of this are going to last for a long time. And with that, I'm going to say thanks for inviting me to be here with you. I'm going to stop sharing, and heck, if there's any questions, we'll take a few questions.
Okay, David, I've got a couple of them that have been handed to me. First one, this is a good one. In your opinion, who recovers first, beef, dairy, pork, or chickens?
Who recovers faster? One of the things that happens is certainly the chicken producing process is a lot faster. So what we see already are sharp reductions in chicken production, broiler production, and then their ability to respond faster just simply because the production process is shorter in chickens than it is in hogs, than it is in beef, and that it is in dairy. Slowing down milk production is not you have to have a calf before you can have milk production from that cow. And so I think a good lesson for a lot of people who aren't involved in agriculture is that we do deal with biology. It's not like flipping the switch on a factory. And so in that regard, chickens do respond faster, or can respond faster.
Okay. Next question. What are the prospects for fall wean calf prices?
Usually I get asked that one first, and we get the hard one right out of the chute. I tell you, long-term on the calf price thing, I'm more optimistic. I think we do have the luxury of time on the calf side for spring-born calves that are sold in the fall. I think we certainly have some opportunity in place to see higher calf prices this fall than we had last fall. In the cattle cycle, we've got fewer cows this year than last year, which means we'll have fewer calves for sale. Unless Mark Welch is going to tell us something different, it looks like we're going to have a heck of a lot of feed and low feed costs, which are supportive to calf prices. I think it also gives us some time to sort through some of the effects of this as these effects ripple forward. So we'll be looking at calves for sale in the fall that would be headed to feedlots and beef in 2021, which gives us, I think, a better price projection than we have now. So my price forecast for calf prices this fall are for, I think, still better prices than we had a year ago.
Okay, and one last question, and this is a pretty good one here. USDA's plan appears to be paying about 85% of the loss up to date, and then about 30% after that. What do you say to people who have most of their output to be marketed the rest of the year, and they're going to get help 30% versus the people who marketed earlier, they're going to get 80% of the help?
Well, it's a pretty tough. There's one of those hard questions about, well, first off, I'd say I don't think we know any of the rules yet, other than that broad thing right there. So we don't know what exactly this is going to mean, how it's going to be, how it's paid out, what the dollar amount is. We might think too some about, big picture. If you weren't going to sell till the fall anyway, and we see what calf prices are in the fall, it may be that you haven't faced injury yet because you weren't selling into this mess that we have. So if we think some about policy, perhaps, perhaps we want to deliver help to folks who really need it because this is when they were selling, and they're truly facing the effects of this coronavirus right now at the time they were selling, versus maybe some folks that were going to be selling in the fall and may not actually realize those losses. And so I think in that regard, that's sometimes a tough answer to hear or to deliver, by gosh. But if we think about it that way, in a way too, we might think about there might be some more help down the road, depending on the path of how this plays out in the future. And so, but at least for right now, I think that may make some sense given those who have been forced to sell into this mess of falling prices and disastrously low prices.
All right, I'm going to ask you one more. I just got handed that was called in. You mentioned the closing of some meat plants while others are opening in the U.S. and Canada. What do you believe the net effect of these closings will be over the next 3 or 4 weeks?
That's really the big question, right? So what's the path of opening and closing? It might suggest to me what I've seen so far is that we seem to have more beef plants opening than closing. So we might get some help on the cattle side, although, I think there's still some details on hot spots and how some of this works out in particularly some cattle areas. On the hog side, I think there's probably more problems on the hog side. I think in terms of a capacity of packing that's closed, probably a larger capacity is closed on the hog side than on the beef side. And we don't yet seem to see many reopenings announced on the hog side, but a lot more risk of closing on that side. So I think the path is going to differ by species. We haven't seen a lot of closings in terms of milk processing yet. I have seen that from, I think, a couple of Leprino plants, but one in Colorado I was thinking about. But the path is critically important as to how this plays out, and I think it's going to differ by species so far.
Okay, I just was handed one more, but I think we're going to have you answer that one, and we'll have it listed on the website with all the other ones that we don't get to answer.
I hope it's the hard one.
It probably was. So thank you very much, David. We're going to switch gears as I want to remind folks, if you just now are tuning in, that if you want to use the question and answer dialog box, type your question there, or you can call our phone number 979-845-5913, and someone will take your call and bring it to me. Now it's time to turn to talk about grains, and I'm going to introduce Mark Welch. He's professor, extension economist, grain marketing here with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Welcome, Mark.
All right, thank you, Joe, and appreciate the invitation from all of you at the Policy Center, Henry and Bart, and the good work that you do in providing this kind of information. I'm going to go ahead and get set up to share my screen as well. and talk about some of the things that are going on in our grain markets. We've kind of got some reference already from what David was sharing with us in terms of the impact of the supply chain and the adjustments and things that we're looking at, and the issues that we're going to deal with, and looking at an oversupply of wheat and an empty bread shelf. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about paper products or petroleum or protein or produce. This is what we're seeing across much of agriculture, much of the economy. And this is what we're trying to sort out as we're moving forward in response to the coronavirus. As David was mentioning, I think in the short term, if there's a benefit for the livestock industry, there's going to be a lot of cheap feed out there. The focus of this presentation, however, is going to be more on a longer term price outlook, looking at the price outlook for the 2020 crop, which we'll be talking about wheat this summer. We'll be looking, of course, of rice and then our other feed grains into the fall. So our primary focus is going to be on the 2020 marketing year, which for feed grains will start on September the 1st. And if you had to draw a picture of what a commodity market looks like, and in this example using grain, they're very similar. You're going to have some aspects of supply on one side of the equation. You'll have your demand aspects on the other, and all those interact to generate some representation of a point in time of what the price is. So we're going to look in just a few moments about some of that disruption that's taking place on the demand side and the price implications that will have for us, but also on the supply side, particularly now that we're in the spring and the planting season for many of our major crops here in the U.S. What do the price outlook and the price situation reveal to us about potential returns from competing crops and the impact that will have on the planting decision that is still unfolding for us, again, across much of the U.S. And if you look at the impact on our customers and then our competing crops, in our use categories, primarily for our feed grains, you can see what's happening there with what's happening in the oil market, and of course the impact that has on ethanol. If you look at feed use and feed demand, who are our customers there? If you look at the cattle industry, the hog industry, the milk that Dave was just laying out for us, obviously a lot of pain and severely low prices there. Now looking at the other crops, as producers are deciding what to do this spring and summer, what the production alternatives may have looked like. Seeing the decline in cotton and corn have been pretty similar at this point. Soybeans, not quite the degree that corn has fallen off, but certainly still down hard. But then you move it to our feed grains, to our food grains compared to our feed grains, and they are performing much better. Now, there's not a lot of flexibility, obviously, for winter wheat, but we still have some spring wheat planting that's ahead of us. Rice acres, not everybody can switch and grow rice, but it's interesting to note the contrast of how those markets are performing under some very similar supply fundamentals that we'll talk about here in just a few moments. But obviously our food grains holding in terms of prices for 2020 to this point, these are compared to prices on January the 2nd, prices as of today, food grains holding up very well compared to what's happening in the feed grain complex. One of the bright spots in presentations that we've been giving about the grain markets for, almost 15 years now, has been the strong increase in world per capita grain consumption. Now that grain consumption, that goes across feed grains, food grains, and also includes soybeans. But starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, we began on a strong upward trajectory of world per capita grain consumption that's driven us to increases of over 1% growth per year per capita. And of course, in addition to that, there's about 1% more of us in the world per year. But we've seen that strong rate of increase. We can see that pivot point in about 2002, 2003. And then that's seen some indication that may be leveling off here in the last couple of years. And so trying to find something that might explain that line. What would be a correlation or corresponding data series that would support that strong increase in world per capita grain use? And I can find some correlation between grain use and average income per capita. If you look at the growth rate of per capita income in what we call the emerging or developing economies of the world, places like Brazil, Russia, India, China, Mexico, Southeastern Asian nations of Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia. As those economies began to grow, as the middle class began to expand, as disposable income began to increase in the late 90s and early 2000s, that drove or was correlated strongly with an increase in grain consumption. We're talking about things like food and feed and fuel, all those things that are very important to the grain industry. However, 2014, 2015, several of those areas hit some economic rough spots. Growth slowed down. Several of those countries went into recession. And that's correlated then with some leveling off of that growth pattern we saw in grain consumption. So now, what will the impact of the coronavirus and COVID-19 have on world grain consumption based on its ties to GDP growth? And you'll likely see this slide again when we talk about the cotton market. But you'll see that the current projections are for a steep drop in global GDP from the world total, the world average, which would be the green line. The blue line would represent the advanced or developed economies. And then those emerging and developing economies we're just talking about would be the red line in this series. For the last 2 years, the GDP growth was slowing as an impact of the trade dispute we've had with China. And as in the context of that slowing rate of growth, now, of course, we have the coronavirus. And so rather than seeing the black line, which is projected growth of GDP in 2020, we're seeing now this severe reduction. So obviously that's going to have an impact and ripple through the grain markets, given the correlations that we were just talking about. This chart is one element of the corn market. I think that puts much of that into perspective and into focus. And this is projected U.S. motor gasoline consumption. So obviously the primary demand base for ethanol is the renewable fuel standard and the requirement to blend 10% of our nation's gasoline supply with ethanol. And you see the sharp drop in projected gasoline consumption. These are estimates by the Energy Information Administration, with the bottom of this projection being in April, and then some degree of growth and rebound back to levels in February and March, perhaps by August. So again, sharply lower levels of ethanol production and corn for fuel in the short term. By the time we get to the new marketing year in September, October, November, perhaps being at levels that we were before of this current collapse. But it's interesting to note what was happening to U.S. motor gasoline consumption prior to the current situation. If you look at billions of gallons, and this is organized, this data is categorized by corn marketing year. If you look at 2017-18, 2018-19, motor gasoline consumption in this country was not increasing. And so we're looking at an industry that was looking at some adjustment, not the severe drastic adjustment we're seeing now, but we were looking at some adjustment that was going to be required by the biofuel industry heading into this situation. And it's one we'll still contend with down the road as conditions do improve and recover. So if I had to give you an outlook of where I think corn prices are going to be at harvest for kind of a Midwestern or a Texas High Plains producer in October, if I had to predict what the October futures price of the December contract was going to be, on this chart, I've got a number down here of about $3.40, $3.45 a bushel. Now, how did I come up with that number? I used a planted acres number of 91.4 million acres and a yield of 175. The prospective plantings report that came out in late March reported U.S. farmers are going to plant 97 million acres of corn this year. If that were to be the case, we're going to see a lot more supply pressure on this market than gives a price of $3.44. But I think what we've seen in the last several weeks is we've seen that price relationship between soybeans and corn shift to a degree that it could affect the actual plantings in the Midwest, in that soybean production has moved to a point that could be more profitable for many of those producers than corn. And so for those with that flexibility and that would respond to that particular market signal, I don't anticipate that we'll see that 97 million acres planted, but obviously it's still a big question. There's still a lot of uncertainty of what that acreage number is going to be, but using a number as low as 91 million, which is only about 1.5 million more acres than last year, still higher, but not near what we saw above last year and not near what's in the prospective plantings report, we're still looking at prices around where we are trading right now. December futures closed today at 330 a bushel. So these were the kind of numbers that would get us to that level. One of the bright spots in the feed grains is we are seeing some resurgence of exports, particularly when it comes to grain sorghum. You may hear about that a little bit more from Dr. Ribera and talking about agricultural trade. But this marketing year, we're not looking at exports near where we were in 2014 and 15, but China is re-entering the sorghum market as their economy perhaps is recovering somewhat from the effects of the coronavirus. If we continue to see the growth prospects for sorghum, while grain sorghum in terms of price will not separate itself from the overall influence of the feed grain market by corn, and we're looking at lower prices currently and in the next marketing year, there may be opportunities for that premium or that price relationship for grain sorghum to improve relative to corn. So rather than trading at the discount that we normally see for grain sorghum, we may actually see that discount sharply reduced, or perhaps even in those markets that can take advantage of these trading opportunities, grain sorghum trading at a premium to corn again. And so, of course, that would be very positive for our feed grain outlook. So those are kind of factors that we're looking at. Higher corn acres, energy feed steady, perhaps fewer DDGs. We're going to feed less wheat. Fuel use, we're going to cut hard this year, but maybe a small increase from there. But of course, the global economy, trade, and ultimately, of course, weather on that supply. Looking very quickly then at the food grain complex to wrap up, that's what our global supply situation looks like for wheat and rice. All-time record high supplies for both of those food grains. And yet we're seeing prices holding up very strong relative to some of our other commodities and the rest of the agricultural situation. That's likely to change, however, moving forward because of this. That is the long-term weather outlook based on the likelihood of La Nina conditions returning by late summer, early fall. And if we were to see that La Nina weather pattern redeveloped, that would certainly be unfavorable for wheat production down the road for the United States, for Argentina, but would be much more favorable, for instance, for Australia. Particularly, it would be favorable for rice coming out of Southeast Asia, where 7 out of the 8 top producers of rice in the world are located. Certainly that could add to the supply situation for rice moving forward in the 2020 crop year. And that chart just indicates where those wet areas would dominate if we were to see those La Nina conditions return, again, primarily benefiting Australia and Southeast Asia. We've got some challenges ahead. Back in 2013, one of the managers for Wells Fargo made a statement, when we loan money, we back the jockeys, not the horses. They want to work with producers that have a plan, that are going to manage the race. And to manage a race and to manage marketing aspects, it takes time, it takes discipline, and it takes relationships. And those factors are going to be critically important to getting through short term in the impacts of this COVID-19 crisis, but also would benefit agriculture longer term as we emerge from this situation moving forward with what those markets will lead. So appreciate the time to be with you today, and I'll turn my screen back over.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions for you.
You bet.
The first one you talked about in your presentation. There are 2 staples, rice and wheat, have not seen the price declines other commodities have experienced. Will it last?
Probably not. Based on that situation that we were just showing of what the longer-term production prospects are likely to be, one is for those nations that are concerned about domestic food supplies or domestic food inflation. We are seeing some evidence of trade limitations, trade restrictions. Hoarding is probably too strong of a word, but some restrictions on protecting domestic supplies. As we do emerge from this situation in the context, again, of record high food grain supplies. There's not a shortage of food grain. It may not be where it needs to be in the form be ultimately consumed, but the product is there. And so I think this is a short-term situation that once we see the production prospects of the wheat crop coming off this summer, and then the outlook for higher rice supplies moving forward, I think we'll see some easing of those kind of worries and concerns, and then that we could see then some price pressure then in those markets as well.
Great. Okay, this next one is a long one. Looking at the most recent planting progress report, it appears we are ahead of the year-over-year and 5-year average planting pace. Do you feel that this rate of planting progress lends itself to more corn acres being planted, or do you think other economic factors will dictate planted acres more so?
You know, I think much of that situation has changed over the last even 4 or 5 years in that, yes, typically we'd see farmers are planting corn and they'll plant corn all the way up until the middle of May when it's getting too late for corn and you need to get your beans in the ground. And so you get everything you can done the first month of planting and then you switch over to beans. We're seeing soybean varieties that perform much better in cooler soils. And we're seeing soybean plantings progressing at earlier rates than we did 5 or 10 years ago. So I don't think we see that big delay of soybean plantings versus corn that we used to see, which I think brings into play more of a market response. And so I anticipate this soybean corn price relationship to have a higher level of influence in the current situation than we might in other years. We don't know. We'll find out in the end of June what farmers actually did. But again, given the degree that we tend to plant soybeans earlier now than we used to, I think it takes some of that calendar out of the equation and perhaps brings markets and market influences to a little higher level.
Great. Well, that's all your questions. You get off a little bit lighter than some of the other guys.
Thank you very much.
If we have some come in later, then I'll get them to you, and I'm sure you can get us some answers we can get posted for the individuals. Appreciate your time, Mark. Now we're going to turn to looking at cotton markets with John Robinson, who is professor and extension economist, cotton marketing.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to the Texas Ag Forum. If I could have somebody up at headquarters load my presentation for me. And let's advance it to the second slide. I'm going to try to compare and contrast the outlook for cotton with what we've seen with grains and livestock. There's certainly some parallels when we talk about the impact of the COVID situation. This is the background slide, though, for my presentation, and basically it's the proverbial picture of good news and bad news. And you're looking at the bad news. What's already happened in the last 3 months, we've seen ICE cotton futures decline 20 cents and recover only about a nickel or so into what looks like range-bound trading. The first part of the decline months or so ago was, I would attribute to just fear, panic, and uncertainty, but it's now focused decidedly on recessionary expectations, let's call it that. And you can advance to the next slide, which Mark Welch has already shown you. This would sort of be our baseline. This was the projections of GDP before all this COVID virus pandemic thing happened. And I guess the good news, if there's any, is that I don't need to spend 15 minutes talking to you about what the trade resolution or the phase one agreement was going to do, or the impact of interest rates, or the impact of speculative buyers and sellers, because all that stuff is secondary now to what's shown on the next slide. And that is, again, the precipitous drop that's projected in the economies of the world. And so the question is, how deep and wide is that dip? And if you believe, I want to believe what the IMF is forecasting here, that is, although it's a bigger dip, a deeper fall than the 2009 economic crisis, it's a rather short period of time till they're projecting a strong recovery. And I sure hope that's true for the sake of, for the sake of my personal family finances, for the sake of the Texas economy, and for the sake of the cotton market, because we know that cotton, perhaps more than any ag commodity, tends to follow broader financial markets and tends to follow basically the economy up and down. And this particular situation is even more pronounced. Go ahead and advance it to the next one. Because not only does cotton generally follow the economy, unlike the other crops, unlike grains, unlike meats, cotton products, retail apparel, and home furnishings are probably the most discretionary types of items. They're the things that have been in stores that are not essential. I mean, I've gone to Lowe's and I've gone to the grocery store, but I haven't gone shopping for clothing, and nobody else has either. So it's unprecedented, the extent of shuttered businesses and sheltered consumers around the world that can but not have a huge impact on cotton consumption, on apparel, all the way up the supply chain. The only evidence we have of that impact on demand so far are some recent cancellations of U.S. export sales, but USDA has reflected a little bit longer term, reflected drastic cuts to the old crop meal use and U.S. export demand. If you flip to the next slide, you can see those latest WASDE adjustments. Those are pretty small, but the red circle shows the month-over-month change in world meal use, and that's huge. That may be a record. It's the biggest one I've ever seen. That little ugly burnt orange colored circle there circles the dip month over month, the adjustment from 16.5 million bales of U.S. exports to 15. That's as big as I ever remember. And the effect on ending stocks is predictable. We're having bearish, large increases by these adjustments. Go ahead and flip it. Now, in spite of all that, the market didn't react. It didn't sell off more. We were already trading at low levels, but it didn't sell off more after those USDA numbers came out. And that may be for various reasons. I would attribute it mainly to the fact that there's not many people on the selling side of things lately. The commercials aren't selling because they're not transacting much business, so they're not in the market hedging. Speculators who might be selling this market or trying to sell this market lower are apparently not daring to do that because the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world are creating trillions of dollars out of nothing and injecting them into the economy, and that would raise inflation expectations. And I don't think a hedge fund manager wants to be on the wrong side of that. And one other thing I'll say, which is probably helping from the cash market side, is that some of the biggest adjustments, the monthly adjustments and the highest levels of ending stocks are in countries that are actively supporting cotton prices with taxpayer dollars. And so that's kind of taking away the need for these markets to adjust downward quite so much. So anyway, but the outlook is still just at the levels we're at. I'm really not expecting old crop prices to do much more than try to breach 60 cents maybe. And like what was said about meats and grains, these are long-term effects. The fear and panic part of it will subside, has subsided to some extent, but the long-term damage to the supply chain and to just the normalization of demand will take a long time. If you just stop and think about all the spring apparel, think about all the Easter dresses that were not bought this year. And so all those retail industries did not collect that revenue. They don't have the wherewithal they would normally have, the cash flow to place their orders for fall stuff. There's just a lot of disruption. And perhaps, again, more so in the apparel industry, just because it's that much more discretionary, that much less essential. And I think it's been massively disrupted. So prices haven't fallen. There's not that much from a marketing standpoint we can do about it. If you flip to the next slide, I kind of wanted to lay out a picture here, and this is a very simplistic, stylized picture of the support that we're getting under existing farm programs for cotton. This is representative of a South Plains irrigated, part dryland farm with seed cotton base. And so what I've got here is assuming that someone sold earlier in the year or sold when NASS says that the majority of 2019 bales have been marketed, and that is earlier, before prices had tanked all the way. That gives us a marketing year average price projected by NASS of 59 cents. So if you figure that into both the market receipts and the PLC payment, again, this is incredibly simplified, then on those seed cotton base acres that you planted that are eligible for payment, you'd get something representative of this, and you get a price that circled price in red is a supported price in the 60s, upper 60s for that part that actually receives PLC payments. Now, there's the fraction of your seed cotton base that doesn't receive a payment, and then there's farms in Texas, north of the Canadian River, that don't have very much seed cotton base, and so for those kind of situations, you'd have, I guess, a not so shallow loss representative of that blue area, but nevertheless. Flip to the next one. If 3/4 of growers marketed earlier in the year, then that leaves another quarter that are dealing with the situation of cotton that they're having to put in the loan or down there at very, very low prices. And so what you wind up with in that situation, again, in this very simplified representation, is a little bit of trade-off of market receipts in favor of LDP payments and a somewhat lower total realized price. Go ahead and flip it, and let's talk about the new crop situation. Again, I think the uncertainties related to demand are going to be unfolding. I think they're going to be large. I think they're going to take a while. So they're going to be with us with the 2021 situation. So the real question right now is the acreage, and that is the most moving target, changeable, fluid question as I've ever seen it in any year. I have a simple approach to predicting what planted acres would be just based on relative prices, but that simple approach has been giving me different answers from October to January, going in one direction and now back in another direction. And then the March 31 number came out with a very high predicted acres, 13.7, about 3 million acres more than I was actually thinking. Perhaps capturing a period of time before prices had taken their full plummet. So again, the June report will be revealing. But flip to the next slide just to see kind of where we are now. The most recent relationship of corn futures to cotton futures, which that ratio, unlike what it says here, that ratio right now pencils out about 5.8. And if you judge from history, a corn cotton price ratio around 5.8 would give you around 12 million acres planted, somewhat less. I do expect fewer acres planted than what USDA measured in March. So 12 million sounds somewhat reasonable to me. So I'm just going to go with it and flip to the next slide, and I'll put that in my balance sheet. On the right-hand side there, we have 12 million planted. Assuming that those La Nina dry conditions don't kick in until harvest time, then I'm just going to assume average abandonment of 15% and a yield of 800 pounds, and that'll give us a 17 million bale crop. We're carrying in a huge amount of cotton from the previous marketing year, so we're still dealing with something pushing 25 million bales, 24.75 million bales of supply, which is a lot. Assuming that domestic mill use and I hope exports in the next marketing year are similar to the level that they are in this one, we're still left with a high level of ending stocks, a second year of very high ending stocks. And if that's the case, go ahead and trip the animation. Just hit return. If that's the case, if we do wind up with, 6 pushing 7 million bales of ending stocks, we're going to just have more of the same. We're going to have futures range bound in the 50s, low 60s maybe. We're going to have cash prices supported by the loan. We'll probably have a larger payment rate, seed cotton payment rate for the PLC. And so, again, not much one can do about that from a marketing standpoint when we're already in the situation of low prices. Flip it to the next slide. It'll just give us, again, a situation where we're trading off some market receipts. We're receiving some support from the loan program, LDP payment, or the other various ways to access that to get a support price at the loan, and then a PLC payment that's probably larger than what it would be for the current marketing year. And with that, Joe, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, John. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. That way I can get to this question for you. So the very first question is, I think you answered both of them, but let's make sure. Is the price of cotton outlook solely rests on China and the Phase 1 agreement, or are there other factors?
Yeah, there are other factors. It doesn't solely rest on it. The pandemic's effect on the whole global cotton market is just a bigger deal and a more serious deal than the China trade situation was, which was important and which is still important, but we now have a bigger problem.
Okay. Next question. I know I heard you say this part, but let's talk about it for a second. How long does it usually take once GDP starts to increase to get the recovery at the producer level for cotton?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have a precise answer to it. It has to essentially, you have to get to a point where people are feeling wealthy enough to spend money on things like apparel. So how long does it take for consumers to get out of their savings mode, their scared, hunkered down mode? I would say, just me thinking about it, just from the medical fix to this is going to take months. We're going to all have to get convinced that infection rates are going down, and short of a vaccine, it's going to take a long time till everybody's convinced that it's safe. It's going to take even longer before I think people start becoming spendthrifts at retail outlets. So if GDP is recovering like the IMF says it is in hopefully the spring, early 2021, I think there's going to be lags. So, I hope demand is perking up in the fall of 2021, but I don't really see it pulling up on this market in the short run.
Okay, well, that exhausts the questions. Anything you thought of that you wanted to go ahead and?
I've had some questions lately about what was, the market was higher last week, and it was higher on rumors of Chinese buying. That put about 2 cents into the futures market. What I would want to say about that is, number one, that'll be confirmed one way or the other. If there was large Chinese buying, 1 million metric tons, that'd be 4 million bales. That's a lot, but that would show up as large numbers in export sales reports that we would maybe start to see this Thursday and the following couple of reports. But even if that's true, that's not real demand. That's not commercial demand to spin yarn and make clothes. All that is, if it's the Chinese reserve buying, that's simply shuffling ending stocks from outside of China into China. So it perked the market up this week, but or last week, but I don't know that it's really that meaningful. Not trying to be a downer.
No, that's good to know. We need to have as much information out there as possible. So thank you very much, John. Appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to turn to Luis Ribera. He's going to cover some specialty crops and trade. Luis is a professor at Extension Economists, International Trade and Transportation. Welcome, Luis.
Thank you, Joe. Let me share my screen. Share. All right, can everybody look? Can everybody see that? All right, I'm not going to be the one that's going to mess it up then. That's good. All right, well, thank you again for the opportunity. I wish I was better news, but there's a couple good news there. I think. Again, we're the largest horticultural exporter, 137 billion in 2019, lower than last year. That was about 140, but still, very solid numbers. Importing about 131 billion, a little bit higher than 2018. Still, around a third of U.S. farm income comes from trade. Hence, it's so important. Now, the trade outlook was looking positive. I was so looking forward to talk to you all in 2020 because things seem to be lining up to be good news. You know, over the last 3-4 years, there's been a lot of issues, trade wars and back and forth and tariffs and all that. And I was so looking forward to 2020 because things have started to look very positive. And I'm just going to go straight into why. You know, now on the positive note, that these trade deals, which I believe they're very, very positive. They're already signed, so they're still going to be there once we get through this pandemic problem. But so they're still there. The three main ones there will be the USMCA agreement, which is called a NAFTA Plus, US-Japan agreement, and then the US-China Phase 1, which is also a major one over there. Now, why NAFTA is so important for us is because of the 137 billion agricultural exports that we send to the world, 40 goes to those countries. So we trade a lot with our neighbors on the north and on the south. And if you put your consumer cap as well, we import quite a bit from them. The 131 billions that we import, 52 come from those two countries. And as you will see, things can go, you know, there's going to be a lot of risk or changes in the world, but when you look at the numbers between our exports from and imports from Canada and Mexico, they remain fairly even. They don't change that much because there's as Mark Welch was mentioning, there's a lot of relationships going over there. We know what they have and we know what we have, and vice versa. I get asked this a lot: is USMCA better than NAFTA? And I truly believe that it is. This is a list of main changes, like the elimination of the Canada milk classes 6 and 7. Setting standards for biotechnologies is very important. Remember that NAFTA was a 25-year-old agreement, and biotechnology wasn't that big then. And there's some other changes as well. It is better. How much better? Well, we'll remain to see. And I'm talking mainly about agriculture. Was it worth going through all this? Well, I don't know. We'll hopefully yes. And the good thing about it is that, again, you know, we have a signed agreement. We have the rules of the game. Let's just play it and try to take advantage of it as we've taken advantage of NAFTA over the last 25 years. The US-Japan, that was also very, very important because if you remember when the Trump administration got into office, they pulled out of the TPP. And one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that we wanted to sign or be part of the TPP was to get a trade agreement with Japan. And you can see on the graph here that we have a tremendous positive trade balance with Japan. We export quite a bit and we don't import that much of agricultural products. So for agricultural products, it's a really good market, huge purchasing power, very trusted customer. So it's very important to have that. And I'm glad that we got something. This just shows where the top 5 agricultural exports to Japan in 2019, about close to $12 billion, mainly on grain and feeds, livestock and meat, horticultural products, and oilseed and products. I'm very excited about the livestock part because us pulling out of the TPP put us in a tremendous disadvantage from our main competitor for the Japanese market in beef, Australia. And under the TPP, their tariff for TPP members, we're going to go down from about 35% tariff to about 8 or 9% tariffs over the next 5 to 10 years. So we would have been at really, really disadvantage with Australia. Now we're on the same playing level field, so that's really good for our beef producers as well as for other products, as I listed here, and I believe our presentation is going to be available for participants, so you can read more specifically of what are the things that they were discussed and agreed upon. But basically, the main thing is reducing tariffs on products such as fresh and frozen beef and pork, country-specific quota for wheat and wheat products that affects our Texas producers as well. They will also eliminate tariffs on several specialty crop, tree nuts, and grain sorghum as well. And so anyways, and then the stage tariff elimination of other products. So it was really good that we had that sign. And again, you know, if we didn't have this coronavirus issue, you know, we would have been, I think, you know, an increase on our exports there. But on the positive note, again, these are already signed and going. Now the China phase one, that's another one that is been in the news after last year that we were having this back and forth with China. 2018 that we reduced our export from a high of about 26.5 in 2012 to about 9.5 in 2018. It rebounded a little bit, especially towards the end of the year, with getting to about 13.5, and it was looking positive again because we have this phase one agreement with China. So just looking at it, in the 2019 numbers, we exported about 13.8 billion. Top five again, very, very heavy on oilseed and products, but also on grapes and feeds, livestock, horticultural products, and cotton, which is very important for our producers here in Texas as well. I borrowed this graph from the American Farm Bureau, where it just shows what it was, what's in it, the phase one, and it basically uses a 2017 baseline of 19.5, and then for 2020 will increase of about 12.5 billion worth of extra agricultural products, and for 2021 19.5. So reaching about 32 and 39 billions over the next couple of years, which you haven't seen that. Again, the highest was in 2012. And they're going to strive to get an additional 5 billion each of the years. So it could reach to about 37 billion in 2020 and 44 in 2021. Now, just looking at some numbers, this is a monthly cumulative exports to China. And the top line, the blue one here, is that if we were to reach phase one in 2021, so we will get to $39 billion worth of agricultural exports. How much do we need to be exporting on average every month? And on this one, we have we have to be exporting about 3.3 billions every month. Now and I didn't add the other 5 that they're going to strive to do because it was a bit too much, but this one is what they signed that they were going to do. Now on the yellow one is that what we're supposed to be for this year. At the end of this year, we're supposed to get to about 32 billion. That will be about 2.7 billion of agricultural exports per month. Now, this light blue one here is in 2012. That was the year that we exported the most to China, reached about 26.5. So you can see that it started about, very close to where we're supposed to be exporting in for phase one in 2020. But then you can see that there's a seasonality component there. And that is basically what happened is that that's what because they import so much soybean. That's what the Brazil soybean starts to come into place because of being on the southern hemisphere. Their seasons are opposite. So that's when they start harvesting and then starting to get a little bit less exports, especially soybean from the U.S. And then at the end, again, they're starting to pick up back up when we're harvesting our crop at the end of the year. So there is a seasonality component on this one. Now, again, the light blue one is 2012. That's the year that we exported the most to China. We only reached about 26.5 billion. The green one there was last year. So we reached about 13.5. Well, and the red one is right now, the numbers that we have, we only have numbers for January and February. And March numbers are supposed to come next week. So we'll see what's going to happen, how the trend is going to be from there. But as you can see, we're lagging way behind on the average to reach phase one, either on 2020 or 2020 or 2021. The number that I've seen from China is that they, for March, they imported about 49% of their beans from Brazil and about 40% of their beans from us. However, that was the month that they have imported the lowest amount of soybeans over the last 12 years. So those are not encouraging numbers. We'll see again what it's going to be. Of course, there's other products that we send to China as well. But again, this is how it looks now, and it will be really hard to get to those numbers on phase one 2020. The number that I've seen from USDA, they're forecasting about 14.5, maybe 15 billion by the end of the year. So we'll see what happens. But again, we're lagging behind there. I apologize for this slide that have a bunch of numbers, but you have to understand we're economists, and I love that I like to have all those numbers there so I can explain them. And I wanted to show quantity and value as well, just to show the impact on the quantities that we export, but the same thing of the impact on the price. And sometimes they go together, sometimes it's different. I got here agricultural exports on the top part on quantity from 17, 18, 19, and then percentage changes from 17 to 18 and 18 to 19. When 18 to 19, that's when we were going to the hard part of our China war, which started in 2018. Now, on the total here, you got total exports, and then you see that from 17 to 18, we're going still to this trade war and issues with USMCA and these tariffs on aluminum and steel. We had about a 1% increase in terms of quantity of our exports. Now, in terms of for 18 to 19, we did have a reduction of 9%. That's when we have a big decrease of our exports. But when you look at these are the 5 top markets for our agricultural exports. We account for about between 50 to close to 60% of what we export. Look at what happened in China for the changes from 2017 to 2018. There was a 65% reduction in agricultural exports to China. And a lot of that had to do with beans, but the other products as well. Remember, we went from about 19 billion to about 9.5. But look what happened to our exports to the European Union. In terms of quantity, about offset each other. Okay, and that's what basically happened, because China was paying for a premium for the Brazilian or South American grains, and so much that Brazil and Argentina sent more than what they could handle, and they ended up importing some grain from us at a discount, of course. But in terms of quantity, it was offset here. Now, when you look at 2019 compared to 18, you see a big spike on China, because we were getting somewhere, and we were about to sign at the end of the year the phase 1, and you got an increase of about 84% from 18 to 19 out of our exports to China, and there's a reduction of our exports to European Union to about 37%, as well as a reduction on Japan, about negative 19. A lot of that went to China. Overall, though, we have a reduction. Okay, let's go to the value part again. From 17 to 18, or 18 compared to 17, there was a 1% increase, and then there was a 2% decrease in 2019 compared to 18. Now you see that for China, we went down in the percentage change of 18 to 17 by about 53%, and we only went up to the European Union about 18%, and if you want to include Japan, they're about 9%. It didn't offset completely. Why? Because of the drop on prices. Prices of our feed grains and oilseeds were very, very low, so it didn't compensate. We sent the same amount but a lot less value. And then for 18 to 19, they flip again. Now I have numbers on the last 3 columns here. Let's go on quantity. We have January and February 19 compared to same month of 2020. Overall, we already have a decrease of about 7% in terms of a quantity exported. And you see that Japan is down by about 22%, European Union 29%, Canada, Mexico. Remember, I mentioned that when you have a relationship with those countries, we have a long-standing agreement with them, they don't move that much. Mexico actually grew about 1%, and Canada reduced only 5%. When we look at value now, it's we can see that it has gone up about 2%, and the reason that it has gone up by 2%, and then you can see China is a reduction of 6%, but an increase on 14% is because we're sending other stuff. We're sending more beef and pork, which are more high value than our feed grains and oilseeds. That's where you see a difference there between those two. And again, a lot more number. These are values for Texas, and because I'm going to be able to share, you're going to be able to look at it one by one. But I want you just to focus at the end here. I want to see the change in the period from January to February. You see the ones highlighted are the positive things for our producers here in Texas. Beef and veal and pork from 19 compared to 17 went up 11.4%, 6.3%, and then at the end, the first couple of months, 16.4 and 60% increase in pork. That is huge. When you look at dairy products, again, the last column compared to a previous year, same months, it was 20.6 and 21.6%. Fresh fruit increased by 11.1%. Rice about 18.2%. Look at sorghum, as Mark was mentioning. Mark Welch was mentioning. China is starting to import more sorghum, as well as Mexico, and we have an increase on demand, as well as cotton, about 20%, and that is also China's doing. Let me just wrap it up talking a little bit about the fruits and vegetables. This is what we have exported over the last 4 years. Remains about probably a small decrease in 2019, but look at our markets, Canada, Mexico. Usually, those are the usual suspects. You got South Korea as well, that we had an agreement signed in 2012, and it was revised to open more their markets for beef and pork, and then Japan as well. Another one that we have an agreement. So looking forward to in the future send those things. Vegetables, same thing, pretty flat, but again, the usual suspect, you got Canada, Mexico there. In Japan as well shows up over there. That's one thing that I want to mention about fruits and vegetables. Well, now let's go to pecans. And pecans, the same thing. It's still now China and Hong Kong starting to come back up. Well, sorry, Hong Kong reduced, but China started to increase. And then Mexico and Netherlands are really good markets for us. One thing to mention on fruits and vegetables is that we're a net importer. So we import more than we export. As you can see, we have a negative trade balance there. And a lot of that comes from Mexico. And this one shows imports of fresh produce from Mexico by truck from 2007, 2019, our history numbers, real numbers, and then we have a forecast. We expect to see a lot more coming from them as well. And Texas is going to be the main port of entry for those products. That's all I got. Well, I have more, but given that Henry already was flagging me already, I decided to stop there. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. You got also my email there, my phone number. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, Luis, there's a couple of questions for you.
Yes, sir.
Most of the data that we have right now was through February, right?
Yes.
So it asks, when the next report comes out, which commodities will be the most negatively affected, in your opinion?
Wow. I think it's going to be our feed grains or oil seeds. Brazil is coming. They're already harvesting, and their production is supposed to be a good one. Same thing for Argentina. So competition is coming strong there. Cotton as well, given that we're going to have we're in a recession. Cotton is one of the first things that are going to go down as well, as people need to eat. They're going to start saving their money for the necessities. So I think those are going to be the ones that are going to be affected the most.
Okay. Here's another one. What is the outlook for the fall Texas vegetable crop? I guess maybe you want to comment. Didn't some of the spring crop have to be destroyed?
Yes, and our report on the effect of the coronavirus, yes, talked a lot with our producers in South Texas for our winter production. A lot of our onions, a lot of watermelons, greens, and kale had to be destroyed because the price was below what it would be to cover harvesting and packing. So there was a lot of donation given to the food bank, but at the same time, when your cost of production, let's say for onion is $2.50 and your price is $3, and to pack and harvest will cost you about $2.50 more, you really don't have much option but just to disc it. At the same time, you have a highly perishable products that lost about 48% of food outlets, even with an increase in the grocery demand, then you cannot store it, so you're out of options. Same thing with also with milk. It's sad, but that's reality.
All righty. Okay, so we got one that was texted to me, actually. It says, how important are ag-related products to China phase 1 commitment, like ethanol, DDGS, infant formula?
Well, again, it depends on how. Supposedly China is back on track in terms of production. I would think that they will be very important, but the question that I have is they were supposed to buy more stuff from us without stop buying from other sources. Something's got to give. They cannot rack up their demand for agricultural products that much without affecting the imports from other countries. And as the numbers that I've seen, they're still importing quite a bit from Brazil and mainly from Brazil, but also from Argentina. I don't know how they're going to make those numbers worked out. On the positive side, again, we have an agreement signed with them, so we need to hold them accountable and see, let them explain why if they didn't reach that $32 billion worth of agricultural products at the end of the year, they have to explain why they didn't.
Okay, last question. It's an easy one. I actually know the answer to this one, I think. Which trade agreement is the most important for Texas producers currently? Then which of the others has the most promise for Texas producers?
Well, I think, again, the elephant in the room is always is China. You have a huge demand there, and it just keeps growing. But at the same time, we have Canada and Mexico there that is good partners with us, and there's a relationship there. And as you can see, things will happen, but the swing of exports to imports, they don't change much because we know those partners. But also the Japan market is huge. We have a tremendous trade surplus there and a tremendous opportunity as well. So if I had to pick one, I'll say China, just because of the tremendous demand that they have and the potential to keep increasing their demand. But I'm just happy that we have all those three, and then we're supposed to be negotiating with the European Union this year. Probably that's going to, we'll see what happens, but the more trade agreements that we have, the better. Again, largest agricultural exporter in the world, we want to get more of our products overseas and increase our market share there.
All right. Well, that wraps up your questions. Thank you very much, Luis.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to the Feature Act, or the next presenter is Bart Fischer. He is the co-director with me at the Ag and Food Policy Center. And Mr. Conaway assured us that he was going to answer all the questions he didn't get to. So welcome, Bart.
Thanks, Joe. Bear with me here as I get everything in one spot. I'm assuming, Henry, you can give me the nod if I'm actually, if folks can hear me. Getting the thumbs up, so that's a good sign. All right. Well, thanks again, Joe. And thanks to everyone who's joining online. A bit of a different approach this year, but glad to be able to use technology to still be able to get in touch, and hopefully we'll be able to do one of these in person this fall. But thanks again for tuning in. Also want to thank Chairman Conaway, now Ranking Member Conaway, for his remarks earlier today. To some extent, mine are going to track very closely with the comments that he made, perhaps going into a little bit more detail, as noted there on the outline. A lot of the time that I'll spend is going to be on the response for agriculture, so working through how Congress has responded, but then also looking at what USDA is proposing. We're also then going to look a little bit at impacts on ag. I know we've talked a lot about that today with my colleagues earlier. I want to revisit a couple of those, mainly as it relates to how we respond going in really into phase 4 and things that we're looking out for. So you're at least aware that that the Ag and Food Policy Center is looking out for those issues and working on your behalf as we work with stakeholders in DC. And then finally, we're going to talk through a couple of other key policy topics. You may be wondering why something like the WHIP program is on the screen now and why we want to bring that up. Primarily because as we're going into this new crop year with a lot of concerns about liquidity and concerns about where the 2020 crop year is going to go, particularly falling on the last 2 years, I think it's important that we identify all of those policy tools that are at our disposal right now. And as I talk to producers around the state and really around the country, it surprises me, how few folks are actually aware of it. And so if you've been at one of the sessions I've done before, you'll have heard me talk about it, and you can tune out when we get to that point. But we'll just do a quick recap at the end. And then I think Joe is going to touch a little bit on ARC and PLC sign up when he's doing his wrap up later. So in terms of COVID-19 response for agriculture, it really has come in 3 different phases so far, or 3.5 as Ranking Member Conaway mentioned earlier today during his remarks. The first one of those was on phase 1. So on March 4th, Congress passed H.R. 6074, which is the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2020. That provided a little over $8 billion in emergency funding, primarily for federal agencies. And so it was really on the front end of the pandemic and ramp up in response. And so a lot of it was focused on funding supplemental appropriations for federal agencies. In phase 2, it was a little more constituent and citizen focused. So, roughly 2 weeks later, on March 18th, Congress passed H.R. 6201, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And that act went into things like, free coronavirus testing, paid leave. It enhanced the unemployment insurance program, expanded a few of the SNAP and food insecurity or food security initiatives, things like that. But it was really phase 3 where we started to see a direct response, certainly for production agriculture, and that's the one that I'll focus on primarily here today. And it followed really about a week after phase 2. So on March 27th, Congress passed H.R. 748, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act. That is the essentially $2 trillion stimulus bill that everyone talks about. It's also the bill that provided, the stimulus checks, the $1,200 per person per filer with income under $75,000. So that was one of the most talked about features. But it was really also the bill that included most of the initial aid for agriculture. And we'll spend most of our time on that. I'll also list here, phase 4. Folks are starting to talk about it. Certainly, we're getting asked a number of questions about it. Our center, we've taken calls from several House and Senate offices who are anticipating the ramp up for phase 4. At this point, I think a lot of it's going to depend on how much the response for particularly on 2020 crops is taken care of under existing authority. To some degree, that could spill over into phase 4. I also think that's where Congress will get more into funding kind of post-farm gate agricultural needs. If you think of ethanol as an example, or everything from ethanol to the cotton mills, I think could fall into that category. And certainly to the extent that they haven't been eligible for some of these other programs for whatever reason. So focusing more then on phase 3, the CARES Act, just for a little bit of a general overview on the provisions that do touch closest to agriculture. The first would be the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. That was a $349 billion program, essentially guaranteeing loans through SBA for small businesses, including farms and ranches, to keep workers paid and employed. It was really focused on payroll. The second was the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or EIDL, the EIDL program. Those are loans primarily for working capital, funded at I think that $10 billion that's listed there on the screen was actually for grants, but relative to PPP was significantly smaller. And then the original CARES Act also included some direct assistance for agriculture. The first being $9.5 billion for ag producers. We'll talk about that a little more. The other was a $14 billion replenishment for the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is really the funding arm of USDA. It's the funding mechanism that we use to fund most of the farm assistance programs. And so there was a $14 billion replenishment that we'll dig into And then finally, it lengthened the maturity of the marketing loan, which we'll cover. I also wanted to note this is where the 3.5, CARES Act 3.5 that Ranking Member Conaway mentioned comes into effect. It's at the note there at the bottom of your screen. So on April 23rd, 2020, which is last Thursday, the House passed this, really revisiting the CARES Act, gave an additional $310 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program. It also made agricultural enterprises eligible for EIDL as well, in addition to giving the EIDL program some additional funding. So to drill down one additional layer then and look specifically first at the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, under the CARES Act. As I noted, it was initially funded at $349 billion. That's now been plussed up to $659 billion. As of yesterday morning, they opened that portal back up around, I think, 10:30 yesterday morning. And if just reading the general news, they already were experiencing overload and the system was crashing due to demand. So clearly a tremendous amount of interest in that program. It really builds on SBA's, or the Small Business Administration 7A loan program. And really all existing lenders were automatically approved, but it also made other lenders eligible, including the farm credit institutions. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the headaches that have come along with that and that continue to persist, but those institutions are eligible, and farms and ranches are eligible to participate. I noted earlier that the purpose of PPP was to keep workers paid and employed. Borrowers must have 500 or fewer employees whose principal residence is in the United States, and they must meet certain size-based restrictions just for that particular industry that they're operating in. Borrowers must also certify that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan necessary to continue their operations. And so for some farmers and ranchers who might not be comfortable certifying that this PPP loan is essential to keeping their operations going, they are going to have to certify. You will have to certify that if you're going to participate. The maximum loan amount cannot exceed $10 million. But really, the maximum loan amount is driven by formula, which is there on the second bullet on the screen. And it's essentially, because this is a payroll-based program, it's 2.5 times the monthly payroll costs over the last 12 months. So they're essentially looking at funding 8 weeks of payroll, build a little bit, or 2 weeks, but a little bit on top of that to cover some other related expenses, but the bulk is for payroll. So that first sub-bullet there of the three then really gets into the crux of how this thing works, and that is, what qualifies as payroll costs. And I could take the entire presentation here to outline all of that, because it is very situation specific, and SBA has rolled out additional details over time, including just yesterday rolling out additional information. Last week, they rolled out additional details about how sole proprietors are treated, including sole proprietors who don't have employees. So that wage that you pay to yourself as the sole proprietor actually can count even with no employees in the operation. And so SBA clarified how that's treated. The second bullet then is something that we've been working on with a lot of groups, and that is, for sole proprietors, SBA clarified on how to use, where to pull the information from Schedule C. But what if you're not a Schedule C filer? What if you're a Schedule F filer? Well, in guidance dated last Friday, that really started circulating yesterday, they clarified that for ag producers filing Schedule F, then they can report net farm profit off of line 34 of a Schedule F. And so the case of a sole proprietor has now been at least been addressed. The final note there of the three sub-bullets is that when you're calculating these payroll costs, whether it be compensation for an individual employee or for yourself as the sole proprietor, any amounts in excess of 100,000 are ignored in that calculation. So you're limited to 100,000. And also, the loans themselves must be used for very specific purposes as defined by SBA. So one of the final points then for getting into a couple of examples is that interest accrues at a rate of 1% with a loan maturity in 2 years. And so payment on the loan does not have to be made for 6 months, but interest will continue to accrue during that period. Probably the most interesting thing about PPP is that the entire principal and interest balance are forgivable if certain conditions are met, particularly on how you're spending the proceeds of that loan over the 8 weeks following the date that the loan was made. The primary thing that SBA is going to be looking at is that 75% of the loan must be spent on payroll. Another way of looking at it is that you can't spend more than 25% on non-payroll items, and there's a list of approved items there, including rent, utilities, so on and so forth. They also clarified, in the second interim final review, that the owner compensation replacement, that on the compensation for sole proprietors, is limited to 8 weeks of your 2019 net profit. So really 8 50-seconds of whatever net profit you had in 2019. And so depending on whether you have employees or not too, that will eat into the amount that is reimbursable. So to quickly get to an example on PPP then, we're looking at, and there in a report that we've got up on our website that looks at the CARES Act. We go into several other examples. Here's one just as of yesterday, using the new guidance on Schedule F. So let's say that you've got two employees with an annual salary of $45,000 each. So you're looking at $90,000 in wages to those two employees, and that's further assumed then, pulling from your Schedule F, that you had $54,000 in net farm profit for 2019. Again, this was a point that Ranking Member Conaway made. If that number is zero or negative, not going to do you a lot of good right now. So they're looking at, the ag industry is looking at some alternatives. But for this, simple example, we'll assume it's 54,000. If you add those two together, then your payroll costs for PPP are 144,000, and you're all right because neither of the employees nor was your net profit above 100,000. So it all qualifies. So then if you look at that on a monthly basis, your qualifying monthly payroll, 144,000 divided by 12 is 12,000 a month. You're able to borrow 2.5 times that monthly payroll amount. So you are eligible for a loan of $30,000. And as long as you spend then that next to last bullet, as long as you spend 75% of that on payroll costs over the 8 weeks following the disbursement of the loan, and that with the remaining amount spent on authorized expenses, then that entire $30,000 loan balance and interest could be forgiven. There are a laundry list of conditions that have to be met in the rule. In this example too, because you are reporting net profit, your owner compensation replacement, it's going to be limited then. In terms of the reimbursement or the forgiveness, you're limited then to 8 50-seconds of that $54,000 profit from last year, which is just $8,300. And so I want to draw that, that last line in particular to your attention. If you're looking at PPP, expecting all of it to be forgiven, it certainly can be, but there are some hoops that you have to jump through to make sure that you're eligible. This shows today, well, as of April 16th, really when the first 349 billion ran dry. It shows where the program was in terms of approved loan value. And while farmers and ranchers are eligible, the maroon pop out here shows that at least by NAICS codes, ag, forestry, fishing, and hunting were only accounting for a little over 1% of the loan volume. And so there's been a lot of hiccups along the way on getting producers signed up. I think partly because the lenders who are doing this that are new to it, there have been a lot of problems in getting some of the lenders approved, not to mention just the general backlog. And it is first come, first served too. And so the 349 billion quickly ran out. The last slide then on PPP, just ongoing issues. Some lenders have reported long delays in the approval process. Just mentioned that one. This, CARES Act 3.5 or HR 266 established a set aside for smaller financial institutions, but apparently farm credit institutions aren't eligible for that. And so there's a lot of back and forth in DC now about that. Again, while Schedule F treatment has been clarified, if you had no net income, no positive profits to report in 19, doesn't do you a lot of good. And so industry is looking at some alternatives that could be used in place of that. And finally, it's still, while there have been some adjustments that Mr. Conaway addressed on seasonality, it's still not clear if and how H-2A workers and their wages are going to be incorporated in those loan applications. The other loan feature under the CARES Act was the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or EIDL. Those are loans of up to $2 million for working capital expenses. Farms and ranches haven't been eligible, but noted there at the bottom of the slide, with passage of HR 266, ag enterprises with fewer than 500 or fewer employees are now eligible. Unlike with PPP, where you go through an approved lender, borrowers apply directly through SBA. There is a portion of that can be in an advance in the form of a grant up to $10,000. That would actually then count against your PPP forgiveness amounts. Whereas PPP is a 1% loan for any amount non-forgiven. If you're carrying it, the interest rate here is 3.75% for small businesses, but the term can stretch up to 30 years. And so if this fits you, if this fits better, if this fits, if you're needing coverage or loans for working capital expenses, perhaps it's something to look at. Again, it looks like there's a backlog in working here too, and that they're trying to clear existing loans before moving. So specifically then with respect to assistance for agriculture, the CARES Act really extended the term on marketing loans. The long and short of it is that we're extending, from the traditional 9 months up to 12 months. It applies for crops from the 2018, 19, and 2020 crop years. Eligible loans must be in good standing with maturity date of March 30, 2020 or later, or be in the new crop year requested by the end of September. And then all new loans requested by September 30 will have a maturity date of 12 months following the date of approval. And I'm not going to walk through the list of eligible commodities, but they're there at the bottom of the screen if you want to come back and look at the video later. In terms of direct assistance for agriculture, there were really a few different avenues. The first is that the Act provided $9.5 billion, and this is a quote straight out of the Act, to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus by providing support for ag producers impacted by coronavirus, including then a list of items that were specifically mentioned. Bottom line is, on the $9.5 billion, the Secretary has a lot of discretion on how to spend that. The second item then was the replenishment of existing borrowing authority. So the CCC can borrow up to $30 billion. We've been stuck on $30 billion for the last 33 years, dating back to 1987. We've been at $30 billion. There was an effort in the Senate, particularly Senator Hoeven, to plus that up to $50 billion. He's also noted that if you just followed inflation, the CCC borrowing authority would be topping out at almost $70 billion right now if we were just keeping up with inflation. But instead, we're at $30 billion. And rather than fully replenishing that, it was replenished to the tune of $14 billion. And that won't be available until after the June 2020 audit report. So we're looking at July. So if you're scratching your head wondering, well, there's 14 there and $9.5 billion, that's $23.5 billion. Why did the Secretary just announce $16 billion? It's primarily because from USDA's perspective, that $14 billion is not technically going to be available until July. And so they're working with the existing borrowing authority that they've got in place. Another item then was Section 32. Section 32 is primarily customs duties. 30% of those are set aside for agriculture. Most of that ends up going to child nutrition programs, but often there's funding left that is used for commodity purchases. Would also note that the phase 2 agreement that Congress passed also included some blanket language that allowed the Secretary to purchase commodities for emergency distribution in an area of the United States during a public health emergency designation. And so that language to us appears to be very open-ended. It's also funded with a such sums as are necessary statement. So it looks like the Secretary would have some pretty significant authority to draw on in those cases. So with the CARES Act then behind us, the question is, so what now? And I suspect that this is the slide that most folks, if you tuned in to, particularly to this session, this is probably the one you're most interested in, and that is, so the president, on April 17th, a week ago Friday, announced $19 billion in aid, $16 billion of that in direct support to farmers and ranchers, and $3 billion in commodity purchases. So how in the world is that $16 billion going to be spent? As Ranking Member Conaway noted earlier, those details still aren't out. What we do know, and part of this is gleaning from comments that USDA officials have made on webinars or on conference calls, or it's through other press accounts. But it's really 85% of the loss on products marketed from January 1st to April 15th for those commodities that experienced a 5% price decrease, and then 30% of expected losses after April 15th. And David got a question during his session on livestock that was drilling into this. And I think he made a really good point at the time too, that if you're looking at this from USDA's perspective, it really makes sense to try to be accounting for a couple of different scenarios here. The first is those producers who are marketing right now, who are experiencing losses right now, but also knowing that this could persist into the future. And so wanting to try to do something as well in anticipation of those losses. And I do believe that that's why USDA came up with the construct that they did. But the devil's in the details. And between Joe and I, we've probably fielded 100 questions or more from producers, from House and Senate offices, and from USDA as well on this particular piece of it. And while I know folks are clamoring for details, I would actually argue my perspective is that it's probably a good thing that we don't have them yet, because it means that USDA is still refining how this particular piece is going to work. And while there were a few press reports over the weekend that said the rule has already gone to OMB, I have it on pretty good authority that USDA is actually still working on it and is still potentially a few days away from sending to OMB for review. And so to me, that's a good sign. USDA is taking input from a lot of people, from our center included, and trying to make sure that they're responsive on that particular piece. And so while you may be disappointed that I'm not releasing rates today, that's really USDA's job to release the dates once they're ready for it. In terms of feedback, and there was a point there on payment limits, but I'll address it on this slide. There have been a flurry of letters floating around. I pulled this one that was from, it was a GOP letter from the House. 121 members, GOP members of the House, sent a letter to the president highlighting several of their concerns on that aid that was announced, that aid package that was announced, particularly on the $16 billion. Far and away, the concern that we hear the most is on payment limits, the $125,000 limit, or $250,000, $125,000 by commodity, $250,000 by individual or entity. I think USDA is hearing that from every single sector. The letter that you see there on the screen notes that there may be a place for payment limit discussions, but at least from their perspective, was that it didn't make sense in this context, and whether you're small or large, everyone is hurting from these losses. Another point that was made really gets at the sub bullets on the previous slide of how that 2016 that $16 billion in aid is going to be allocated. If you look at the crop side, the focus has primarily been on 2019 carryover, so the product that's still being marketed from 2019. And a lot of the questions we fielded, particularly from Capitol Hill, has been why the fixation on 2019 losses. And so I do think a lot of the conversation, the debate going forward is going to be, okay, well, what about the 2020 crop year? We still have the $14 billion replenishment coming, and so a lot of the questions are going to be how. And even this letter at the end addresses that of, okay, well, what about the $14 billion? We can't put it in people's pockets right now, but why aren't we talking now about how that's going to be used? And that's really the third bullet there. Probably the last point I would make on this, particularly with respect to the second bullet, I spoke a little bit about crops. On the livestock front, and this goes to David's question, I do think we've gotten a lot of questions about, well, what's the magic of that April 15th date? And I think it's a legitimate question. And if it's not a question, in our view, it shouldn't really be a question of whether you marketed before or after April 15th. It was really a question of were you marketing during this period? And so I know there are a lot of folks that are hoping in the rule that actually ends up going to OMB that there would be some refinement there, because it would be it's certainly concerning to think that a producer who marketed on April 13th is going to be treated differently than one who kept their cattle on wheat pasture and marketed a few weeks later, or were taking cattle to graze out. And so I know that perspective is being shared in DC as well. So just looking forward in the few 10 minutes or so that remain, I wanted to talk a little bit about impact. Luis alluded to this in the previous presentation. I suspect Joe will bring it up in the wrap up, but we recently put out a report looking at impacts on agriculture, noting that if things don't turn around for Texas alone, we could be looking at $6 to $8 billion in impacts as things unfold. I wanted to drill down a little bit, specifically looking at our rep farms. Our sister center, the Food and Ag Policy Research Institute at the University of Missouri, ran a scenario where they were looking at the macro effects of COVID and really just isolating that specific effect due to COVID. The slide, on the slide, I won't go through these through all the prices, but it shows the percentage change for the 19 and 20 marketing years. We pulled all of that input into our models and looked at the effect on the representative farms. This analysis was done directly for DC and has been shared up there as well. And I don't think there's necessarily any surprises, but it does show you the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. And again, this is isolating just the COVID impact. Never mind that we're already at the tail end of multiple years of pretty poor prices. And so if you look across the row crops that are presented there, and particularly following Mark's presentation on row crops, wheat and rice, we're still not, the whole story hasn't been written on wheat and rice. Things certainly could continue to get worse, but for now, it's really cotton and feed grains that have experienced the greatest impacts. But on the livestock sector, we're looking at net cash farm income for dairy down 58% this year, and for beef pretty closely behind that. And so if we look then, drill down specifically on dairy, if you look particularly at the $125,000 payment limit, we're looking on average across all 21 of our rep farms at losses approaching $350,000. And so that $125,000 limit for some dairies we could hit in a matter of days, if not hours. And so even for our smallest, a third of our dairies that are under 500, some of those are already approaching the payment limit as well. And so it is a huge deal. It affects probably dairy most acutely, but if you're a producer of any size, whether you're a beef producer or a row crop producer, the payment limit could have a huge impact. I know I'm closing in on the time I have available, so I'm going to just skip ahead. These will all be available. You can come back and look at the video and see them. But the last point I'll make before wrapping up with a comment on WIP is really the impact on row crops. We on 2018 and 2019, we went through both of those years. With a significant infusion from the market facilitation payments, the trade aid payments due to the trade war with China. And so, there was a lot of optimism coming into 2020 that things were going to improve, but, the phase one agreement on China ran headfirst into COVID-19. And what I'm showing on the table is really, it's all this by sales closing date, but highlighting March 15th sales closing date, which is probably the most popular date, covering most of central and northern and northwest Texas, but then up through the plains through the Midwest as well. You're looking at a scenario where the price election for crop insurance, and so this is the price at which producers are insuring, is below where we were each of the last 2 years. And with COVID now there was a question earlier in the presentation about MFP, but with COVID really kind of overtaking that conversation, everything's getting rolled together. And so I think from my perspective, it's incredibly important that even though we may not be harvesting for several months, this is the situation that we're facing. We're facing price elections on insurance less than they were the last 2 years. You can probably see that most acutely on cotton. That gray shaded box is the month of February where we are in price discovery. The crop insurance price election then was established at roughly 68 cents. And if you think of crop insurance being one of the primary risk management tools that our producers have, most producers have 70% coverage. And so you'd have to have, if yields stayed the same, you would have to have prices dropping, into the 47-cent range to trigger indemnities. And if they settle out at roughly 55 cents, that's still roughly a 20% loss all within the deductible range. And on cotton alone, that deductible loss could exceed $1 billion on that single commodity before crop insurance ever even kicks in. And so I do think it's incredibly important that as part of this effort that the 2020 crop be factored into that mix and be part of the conversation. And I suspect it will, and certainly will going into phase 4 if additional funding is needed. And so I'm going to zoom forward to the end and make one last mention on WHIP. Again, primarily because sign up began on the 23rd of March. For a lot of the country and certainly a lot of Texas, this will be a source of liquidity at a time when it's really needed. And it's still, as I mentioned earlier, it never ceases to amaze me that there are a lot of producers who aren't even aware that this is out there. Really thanks to Ranking Member Conaway, Ranking Member Granger on House of Probes, and then certainly friends over in the Senate. Drought, excess moisture, and quality losses were added to the WHIP program in December, and sign up began on March 23rd. And so we don't necessarily need a run on the county offices, but you ought to at least be inquiring of your county office about eligibility and sign up. They are overloaded wrapping up ARC and PLC in anticipation of delivering all of this coronavirus food assistance program as well. So they have a tremendous amount on their plate. But this is certainly one of the things that they are taking applications on, if not processing applications. Whether or not you had stacks, particularly in 2018, can eat into the WHIP payment you receive. So I don't want to overstate, because for some of you that did have a stacks indemnity, it can really reduce the amount that you get from WHIP. The payment factor also plays a role. Our center was asked by Representative Conaway and Mr. Lucas in Oklahoma to examine those factors, particularly for cotton. We did that and think that those could be reset as high as 95%. They're currently at 88% in Texas and 79% in Oklahoma. And so, as I understand it, the state committees have met in both states and that those are going through the approval process. And so it's ultimately up to them where they are set, but certainly we had input into that process. The two remaining issues that we're working on now, the first is on irrigation, typically on indemnities that are paid, and we certainly have indemnities on irrigated crops in Texas. Drought is never listed as the cause of loss. It's either excess heat or hot, dry wind. Unfortunately, in the WHIP rules right now, those are not listed as related causes of loss to drought. And so I know that folks are engaging with USDA, and certainly Capitol Hill is engaging with USDA on revisiting that, because it's hard to say that it's hard to make the case that excess heat and dry wind are not directly related to drought. The other then is on insurable cotton following wheat. So if you grazed wheat, whether non-insured or short rated, fairly standard practice to preserve your eligibility for insurance on cotton, yet finding out that producers are not eligible other than in approved double cropping cases. And so that's another one that's currently on the list as well. So with that, I look forward to taking your questions. And I think Henry has been flashing the 1 minute remaining sign for a while, but I still think we're pretty close on schedule. So with that, Joe.
Okay. No, we're good. I'm gonna. You got a lot of questions, so I'm gonna try to put them in groups. And since you just talked about WHIP, let's start with that one first.
Okay.
For the WHIP program, does it matter what crop insurance units you use? For example, does it matter if I have enterprise units versus optional?
Okay, so it absolutely does. The units matter for the WHIP program, and so if let's say just for example, let's start with optional units. Your WHIP calculation is so it's by crop, by unit you're going to calculate your WHIP payment. And let's say you've got two different optional units. On one, there's a positive WHIP payment. On others, there's a negative. There's no offsetting effect there. You're going to file on the optional unit with a positive payment, and that will be the unit you file on. On enterprise units, though, it really, WHIP largely follows the unit structure. And so if you have an enterprise unit for that, all your crops in the county, and you go through that calculation at the unit level, those things are going to offset one another, just like your indemnity would on insurance. And so if you end up with a negative WHIP payment in there, then it can actually reduce the overall WIP payment that you receive for the indemnity. So on optional units, there's no netting effect, no combining. On enterprise units, there is a combining.
All right. Next question is there a possibility of WIP being funded for 2020 or 2021, particularly the drought provisions with the potential of La Nina?
I mean, I'd say there's always the potential. The one thing that I remind folks of, particularly when it comes to 2020 or later years, is that WIP originated with Congress. The very first version was in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. That same bill that added seed cotton back as a covered commodity created the WIP program. And really, it was just essentially a pot of funding with a few named causes of loss, and it was the secretary that created the WIP program in response. And so periodically, Congress comes back, and revisits that, authorizes additional crop years, authorizes additional causes of loss, and then also authorizes additional funding. And so, for example, following the BBA of 2018, Congress came back in June of 2019 and added additional losses, including, for example, the floods that we experienced going into the 2019 crop year. And then again, as I noted in the omnibus appropriations in December, they added drought, excess moisture. And so really that decision is going to be up to Congress, whether they're going to authorize additional crop years and whether they're going to fund it.
All right, now let's switch gears to PPP for a second. You talked about the sole proprietors, how they're treated in PPP. What about the other business structures like LLCs?
Good question. So on the guidance that SBA put out on Friday, or it's at least it's labeled Friday, I think it came out yesterday, they spoke to a variety of different business structures. So Schedule F filers were just one of those. And really it's complicated and it's by business type. And so if I look at just LLC as an example, that's really going to depend on how the individuals file. And so is it treated as a sole proprietor partnership or a corporation is really going to determine how the LLC is treated. So in the case of partnerships, is really the partners that are filing that application, as opposed to having you do it individually. You're really doing it as a partnership. If it's treated as a corporation, the corporation can go file. And so while there'd really been nothing in the first two rules, the interim final rule, the first or the second one, really added no clarity at all. But SBA, to their credit, has since then done that. And so in the very narrow case of the LLC, it's going to follow how the owners file for that LLC, the tax treatment of the LLC.
All right. There's another one on PPP. We received a PPP loan from our local bank. Now we cannot find anyone to work because the unemployment benefits are high. When the Fed extra benefit runs out, so will our time to get this part forgiven. I guess that's kind of a question / statement. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I'll say I get notices and updated FAQs and updated fact sheets about every 30 minutes, it seems like, from DC on this program, because it's continuing to unfold. That scenario may have been addressed. If it has, I'm not aware of it. The last that I have seen is that for forgiveness. So I mean, that wouldn't have a bearing, on your eligibility for the loan. You could continue to have the loan, 2-year loan at 1% interest, but it would have a bearing on the loan forgiveness, because to this point, the only thing I've seen is that you do have to meet the stringent criteria that 75% of it has to be for payroll. And so, the scenario that's described, I haven't gone in and matched up, prevailing rates versus unemployment, that particular aspect of it. But to the extent that you're having a hard time finding employment or extenuating circumstances is certainly something that we can continue to dig into. But I haven't seen, to this point, I haven't seen an exception for that case.
Okay,
that's not to say that the exception doesn't exist, though. So
yeah,
there's a lot of information out there.
Well, here's another one that I've never heard of. What if you filed early and the Schedule F owner compensation was not considered? Can an amended application be considered?
So they do have a lot of, and I would encourage you to work, reach out to your lender on this one too, to see how they're handling it, because there are a lot of caveats in the guidance that's put out. So certainly that the Schedule F guidance is there, but they have a whole lot laundry list of other forms of documentations or other things that you can point to, and so. For something that specific, I would probably encourage you to talk to your lender and see how that they're handling that. I mean, another is that, I'm happy to dig into it more after this, but that one is very nuanced, and we can certainly make some calls if to the extent that you've given us contact information, we can follow up on it.
All right, the next one is a little bit more general, and it reads, what is USDA planning to do with the money that becomes available in CCC in July?
So that's the $1 million question. And, if you went back to I don't have my slides up now, but if you went back to that, the letter that was put out there, most folks right now are pressing for that. They look at the $14 billion replenishment really is just an accounting issue or a cash flow issue. Technically USDA doesn't have it available right now. I can only imagine that OMB has weighed in on that as well, that money is not currently available. But the flip side of that is that we all know it's coming. Congress has already acted. It's just, we're waiting for the audit report in June. That's the metric we measure against. But Congress this time provided them a finite amount of $14 billion. And so we know it's coming. And so if you were to look at that letter, what most folks are suggesting is that they ought to be USDA ought to be incorporating that now, particularly on the row crop side. Some folks have put out estimates. You'll see it floating around out there, 3 billion or 3 point whatever billion for row crops of that 16 billion. None of those are set in stone. Those are really USDA's, kind of estimates of what they anticipate the demand to be. But a lot of folks are looking at that saying, well, one, that's focused on 2019. It's not even really getting into the 2020 crop year. We're following on 2 years where we were paying, significant amounts of MFP. And so that 14 billion ought to be being factored in already. And we already know that this, CFAP program may not be making payments until June. And so if this money's not available till July, we could at least, still be planning, knowing what's coming. And so that is what most folks are pushing for right now, is that the department would plan as though that money were available, even though MFP paid out in several tranches. Most folks say that we could do the same thing with this too, but go ahead and commit it, even if it's not paid till later.
All right, I think you got a couple more questions, but I think in the interest of wrapping up, I'm going to do my little part, and you can answer these for our on our webpage so that everyone can see the answers to them. Thanks a lot, Bart. You had a wide swath of things to cover.
Thanks.
So in terms of wrapping up the meeting, I've got a short PowerPoint that hopefully I can get up here. Without too much trouble. There. All right, so we really appreciate everyone attending. Usually at the end of each in-person ag forum, I give what I would call a relatively depressing speech about making sure everyone understands how serious conditions are in agriculture. I'm going to try to be a little bit more uplifting than that, but unfortunately, most of what I need to say is a little bit more difficult. For most of our lives, we've talked about farmers living poor but dying rich, meaning that the value of the land has held the wealth. So far, that has been the case. And because the land values have held the value, a good value, we've had a situation where people have been able to use them to secure operating loans and things like that. It has been a difficult time for agriculture, meaning that I say it's the fourth or fifth year of flat prices with very little profit. There'll be somebody who said they made plenty of money one year, but basically we're in a situation where prices have been flat and there's been very little profit to be had across the board. Cash flow problems have been and are still pervasive. And, as we said here and thinking about the future, most of the row crop producers in this state haven't really lost anything yet. And wheat, who's, coming to a close, the prices have risen more now than they have been in the last couple of years. So that's a positive. But for most of the rest of the commodities, if we don't get a significant rise before harvest, we're going to be in a terrible situation. The analysis that Bart mentioned earlier, FAPRI modeled a V-shaped path of rebounding very quickly after the problems we've had in the economy. That's the best case situation. If we get something like a W, it's going to be even worse. So just to make sure people understand that while the economy may open up and we can get back to doing a little bit more normal things, how the economy overall and the ag economy fares is going to be something we need to really pay attention to. We've listed here some resources. Again, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension has some specific resources on the COVID-19. Bart had mentioned both of the publications we put out recently. The first one being the legislative responses, and then the second one, the black cover, being the one where we talked about what are the impacts that we've seen so far and what's likely to happen. The next phase of this is to let prices kind of get a little bit firmer, and then we'll have to start worrying about just how big the losses are going to be. One of the things that has happened, I wanted to just briefly touch on, we've switched completely from enrollment on ARC and PLC. The announcement, the information just came out last week for the 2018 Farm Bill, and PLC now has almost 70% of the acres, where in the last Farm Bill it had 23% of the acres. ARC County now has 26% of the acres, where the last Farm Bill was 76%. And one thing that we worked really hard on in the state of Texas was making sure people understood ARC IC was an option, especially for those people who had been prevented planting, which we had some, not as much as the Midwest, but we still had some. 3.9% of the base acres in the country went to ARC IC in this first sign up on 2018 Farm Bill versus 1% last time. So with that as a backdrop, if you look at these numbers and you go to the far right and say, given the projected price by USDA, and we're pretty far along in most of the marketing years, so that even though the low prices we see on the futures market exist, there's not a lot of product being marketed at those prices. So these are they're going to be in the range. If that happens, then here would be the payments under ARC and PLC. ARC, the only way to do that and show this with any kind of realism is to say there wasn't a loss on the yield side. So if it's only a price loss, this was how the payments would work out on ARC County. PLC payment rates, it's a lot more straightforward. It's all price driven. So, there's going to be some payments. And why do I bring this up? Is because cash flow for producers is going to be important. And these payments will be received basically after October 1st of this year. So this is very important in terms of looking at how do we increase the cash flow, whether it's WIP payments that Bart talked about, whether it's commodity title payments that will come in October. If things don't rebound on the selling price, the market price for your commodities, that things to keep the wreck from being worse, we really need to have a lot of government assistance, and when you need it, to help out. Just quickly, a lot of you have seen my charts over time where I kind of pencil out, hey, the red line is market price history plus projections from FAPRI. You can kind of see that from this point forward is FAPRI price projections. You see the big dip for 2020. And on corn, that would be very devastating for producers if the average did play out to be somewhere in the 325, 330 range. But I want to keep in mind that when we look at this, that was the average of a lot of observations. If you looked at the full range of the 500 forecasts that FAPRI did, there would be some that would be considerably lower, some that would be higher. And I'd say that the if this thing is not a perfect shaped bell curve, it's toward the low end, not the high end on those projections. So just keep that in mind, that when we look at these prices, and obviously the red line's below the yellow, so there's expected to be a small PLC payment. If there's not a loss in yields, it doesn't look like there would be too much of one for Ark County for corn. When you look at other crops, seed cotton looks to be kind of in a disaster mode. It would pay regardless. Just so that's where we're at for the seed cotton. If we look at wheat's one of the bright spots, along with rice. That you look at the prices, and yeah, there's still going to be a payment, but relative to what we've had the last few years, prices look like they're on the upswing. And I think that's the same thing with grain sorghum as well. So as we're finishing up here, I can't thank you enough. I can't see all of my screen right this second, but I know that we had more than 200 people stick with us for most of the 3 hours, and that's phenomenal. Those of you that are on the steering committee, you know that when we have an in-person ag forum, a lot of times it's somewhere around 100. Obviously, I think that we had a really good lineup of speakers. I thank Congressman Conaway, David Anderson, Mark Welch, John Robinson, Luis, Ribera, Bart. And then one of the things is you don't know that this thing has actually gone off smoother than any of our practices did. And if it wasn't for Henry Bryant having his class converted to online only, we wouldn't have any experience doing much of the Zoom product. So he stepped in, and he's been running all the different PowerPoints, everything that's happened that looks good. He's responsible for. I really appreciate my staff who's been handling the questions and doing a lot of behind the scenes stuff to make this thing look professional. The last thing I will say is please complete the survey. It's popped up now. If you'll complete that before you log out of Zoom, we really appreciate it. 4 questions, shouldn't take you very long, but we need the feedback from you to see whether this is something that worked very well for you or not. And the last thing I'll say is please take care of yourselves and good luck with everything. We know that times are tough. It's easy to get down, but we're here for you if you need us. So thank you very much.